It was a snowy winter morning, and the girl was busy preparing food for the upcoming dinner. The smell of a juicy steak filled the kitchen as it sizzled on the griddle. She was just about to flip it when an angry woman suddenly burst in, slapping the skillet in frustration. "Why isn't the food ready yet?" she demanded. Without waiting for an answer, she tasted a piece of the meat, spitting it out immediately. "It's too salty," she shouted. The cook, calm and emotionless, looked at her without flinching. "You expect people to eat this? Especially today of all days," the woman continued, her voice rising with irritation. "Maybe I'll replace you with someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe a man." The girl sighed heavily, turning away. Then, with a strange smile, she replied, "Unfortunately, I can't call on my family's employees to do work outside their duties." The woman frowned, shocked by the girl's insolence, her eyes fixed on her. Meanwhile, another voice echoed through the house. A young girl stormed into the room, shouting loudly. "Where's the item I asked you to find?" she demanded. The cook, slightly surprised but unfazed, wiped her hands and handed over a package. But the young girl snatched it from her angrily, tearing it open only to find it wasn't what she had asked for. "What is this?" she shouted, her anger boiling over. The cook, still calm, sighed and looked at the ceiling. "I saw something like it on Instagram a few days ago," she said nonchalantly. "It's kind of popular." "I know." The young girl, now visibly frustrated, held onto the package tightly, refusing to let go. "Don't you dare touch it," she snapped. "Next time, get me what I asked for." As tension simmered, the woman ordered the cook to throw the package away and get some food delivered instead. The cook, on her way out, shouted back that it wasn't her problem, and the woman could handle it herself. After the shouting match, the girl returned to cooking, humming quietly to herself. But soon the woman reappeared, her tones sharp. "You're free this weekend. We're going to the hospital." The girl blinked in surprise. "Why? What's wrong, Mum?" The woman's face twisted with anger. "Why are you pretending? You know exactly what's wrong. It's been over a year since you got married and still no children." She spoke as if it were obvious. "It's your fault. You need to get smart and figure this out. If you can't, I'll do it for you." The girl stood silent, her breath caught in her chest. After a moment, she smiled slyly. "We've already discussed it with Saya. We'll go to the hospital together." Her mother's eyes widened, grinding her teeth in frustration. Clearly annoyed, she sighed deeply and changed the subject, bringing up the vacant position at the girl's company. Then Brandon knew he was being preyed. The girl smiled again and casually mentioned that her stepfather wanted to work there, but Sok had already taken care of it. Just then a man's voice chimed in, offering to help, but the woman quickly cut him off. If my daughter had been as loving as Ura, she wouldn't need help solving everything. She then turned to her daughter, asking, "What's so great about you anyway?" At that very moment, there was a knock on the door. The guests had arrived. The woman's demeanor instantly changed. She greeted them with a bright smile, welcoming them into her home. The guests marveled at the house, praising its beauty. "Has the house gone up by 200 million?" one asked. The woman laughed and said it wasn't that expensive yet, leading them inside as the girl served plates of food. The guests complimented her, calling her beautiful beyond words, and thanked her for the lovely meal. Soon, laughter and conversation filled the room as they enjoyed the feast. After the meal, the girl stepped out for a moment. Her mother called after her, asking her to bring more meat, but the girl was already heading somewhere. When her mother asked where she was going, the girl didn't respond, lost in her own thoughts. A moment later, the girl was gone. The woman, growing tense, started to follow her daughter, but stopped when she saw the girl glowing with joy as she re-entered the room. The guests fell silent, watching in awe. The girl approached her mother with a smile, taking her hand. "Thank you, Mum, for always being so kind to me," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm so lucky to have you." Her mother stood frozen, stunned by her words. Then, with another sweet smile, the girl added, "Sok just called. He wants me to meet him soon." With that, she left, leaving her mother speechless. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the girl sat in her car, the smile fading from her face. She remembered her mother's words, harsh and unfeeling. "Even if today is the day you were born, it's just another ordinary day." The girl hit the steering wheel in frustration, yelling, "This isn't right. It shouldn't be like this." Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Messages from her husband Suk had come in, asking how her day was going. She unlocked her phone to see 4 messages and a missed call from him. Ben began texting her husband. In the first message, he apologized for not being available earlier. The second message explained that he was still delayed in a meeting, but 3 hours later he would finally be free. A small smile crept across U's face at the thought of finally seeing her lover. She exhaled deeply, thinking about everything happening, then glanced back at her phone. 2 hours and 37 minutes had passed. Enduring time with her husband's family, she needed to be at the hotel soon. After responding to Sok, U set her phone down and started the car. As she drove, her thoughts drifted to memories of an evening with her husband. She had been telling Sok that she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. He simply replied, "I know." U continued, explaining that maybe she could sleep in the same room, but never in the same bed. Sok smiled, repeating that he understood. He then added, "You won't have a normal family life with me, will you?" Be confused by the question, U hesitated. Sok's smile widened as he said, "I don't care about anything as long as I have you." Her eyes had sparkled at his words, leaving her speechless. Suddenly, Ura snapped back to reality. She stood in a store, staring blankly at the floor. The cashier's voice startled her, asking if she had placed an order under Suk's name. She quickly confirmed, then left the store, realizing she was running late. Rushing down the street, she heard voices around the corner. As she approached, she realized one of them was Suk. What was he doing here? Then she saw Ura standing next to him. Yu immediately turned away, listening intently to their conversation. Sok was telling Ura that she was the only one he loved, that he didn't need Yu. At those words, U's world crumbled. She froze, barely processing what Sok was saying next, that he would file for divorce soon and be with Ura. U couldn't bear to hear any more. The box she had been carrying slipped from her hands, the cake inside tumbling to the ground. Sok and Ura turned sharply at the noise, and there stood Ura, her face blank and emotionless. Ura immediately rushed to her, calling out and begging her not to jump to conclusions, but Yu already knew. There was nothing left to save. She smiled bitterly, turning away from them. Ignoring their pleas, she began to walk quickly, wanting to escape them, their betrayal ringing in her ears. As Ura chased after her, Yu's steps quickened, her anger growing. Ura finally grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "Please, just listen," Ura begged, for what felt like the 100th time. Furious, Yu asked one simple question. "Did you know that Sok was in love with you?" Ura couldn't answer, her silence revealing the truth. Ura couldn't answer. Then why did you keep hanging around him? Guilt flooded Ura's face. She confessed that Seok was kind and understanding, and she had assumed her feelings were fleeting. Grabbing Yu's hand, she urged her to talk to Seok, that he could change his mind. Ura gritted her teeth, realizing how selfish Ura truly was. Sok chimed in, attempting to defend himself, but U shot him a venomous look. She ripped her hand free from Ura's grasp and walked away, no longer willing to listen to them. Her pace quickened until she was nearly running, lost in a blur of emotion. She couldn't hear or see anything around her, including the crosswalk timer ticking down. A speeding car bowed through the intersection, and by the time U noticed, it was too late. The car's headlights glared like demon eyes in the dark, and in an instant, Yu's body was airborne. Her heel remained on the ground, leaving a red trail behind. Ura screamed, horrified by the sight. Sok instinctively tried to shield her eyes, but the damage had already been done. Tears welled in Yu's eyes as she hung in the air, thinking of one thing. Why had she ever believed Sok could change? In her final moments, everything became painfully clear, but it was too late. Yu died on the very day she had wished she wouldn't. The story shifts back to the past, to an orphanage on a night when it was snowing heavily. Yu had been abandoned as an infant, left crying in front of the door. She had gone through many adoptions and rejections, but one night, a pair of hands lifted her from the darkness. She was adopted by a wealthy family, and for a time, things seemed to improve. But soon after, her adoptive mother, Jumin, passed away, leaving a deep void in Yu's life. What followed was even worse. Her adoptive father, Shanghai, brought home another girl, the same age as Yu. This girl was Ura, who was overjoyed at the thought of having a sister. U had been diligently practicing piano, playing in large concert halls, pouring all her energy into her performances. But no matter how hard she worked, she could never outshine Ura, who excelled effortlessly in everything she did. Yu watched from the sidelines, always overshadowed by her sister, even in their school years. While her parents praised Ura for her academic success, Ura stood trembling as she looked at her own grade sheet. From the moment Ura was born, she had been surrounded by misfortune, always overlooked. She remembered walking down the school corridor, minding her own business, only to open her locker and have a pile of ruined books and notebooks fall out. The students laughed at her, mocking her for being adopted. She knew exactly who had spread the rumors. Yu looked across the room and spotted Yakan, who was laughing with the others, her voice echoing in the corridor. The pain of betrayal hit hard. Her own sister, enjoying herself while Yu stood isolated. At home, Yu tried to reassure herself that things would eventually be okay. She could get through it. But just as she was finding some peace, a noise outside her door caught her attention. Startled, she stepped out of her room to investigate, but the hallway was empty. On the floor lay several boxes and a letter. Curious, she picked up the letter and opened one of the boxes. Inside was a record player. Confused but intrigued, Yu unfolded the note. It was from someone who had overheard her mentioning her love for old things. Embarrassed by the gesture, he explained that he had recorded some of his favorite old songs for her, hoping she would enjoy them. At the end of the letter, he wished her a happy birthday. The sentiment overwhelmed Yu. She quietly turned on the record player and let the music wash over her. Tears welled up in her eyes. It was the first time anyone had done something so thoughtful for her. Immediately afterwards, she told her friends. Years later, those memories remained vivid. Yu had never planned to marry Suk, but the daughter of the president of WJ Retail marrying the son of his driver felt like a fairy tale. Despite her parents' decision, Yu still felt like an outsider, and Suk's affection seemed to be the only genuine part of her life. She remembered his words, how he had once promised to try as long as they were together. But now, those same words felt hollow, tearing at her heart. Her thoughts snapped back to the present. She was still standing in front of that speeding car. In a blink, Yu was airborne, her heel left behind on the ground. The echoes of Sok's betrayal, the man who swore to her sister Ura that she was the only one he loved, rang in her ears. Her world had been stolen from her, piece by piece. And just like that, Yu's hard life came to a tragic end. But then, something strange happened. A voice called to her, faint at first, but growing louder. Yu's eyes shot open. She was alive. Confused, she found herself back in her bed, with Ura standing over her, asking how she was feeling. "What?" Yu gasped. "Wasn't she dead?" Slowly, she sat up, disoriented. Ura smiled and reminded her that today was the dress fitting for her wedding. She must look her best. Ura's heart raced. Was this a dream? She hurried to the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to make sense of it. Grabbing her phone, she checked the date. July 19th. But that couldn't be right. Wasn't it supposed to be November 20th? She blinked, staring at the strange marking on her wrist. Panic set in. Could it be that she had somehow travelled back in time? Determined to make the most of this second chance, Yu went to her dress fitting, trying to play along. The seamstress tightened the wedding gown, and as Yu stood in front of the mirror, she sighed, holding back her emotions. The sales clerk asked if everything was all right, and Yu reassured her it was. But when she saw Sok, looking enchanted by how beautiful she looked, her smile faded. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a bouquet and swung it at him, hitting him squarely on the head. Shocked, Sok asked what was going on, but Yu only smiled bitterly. Grabbing a pen from Seok's pocket, Yu tore the wedding dress right down the front. The saleswoman was aghast. Yu declared that this was her marriage dissolution gift to Seok, then casually handed over her credit card to pay for the now ruined dress. As she left the shop, Yu knew that this was her turning point. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Later, Yu met with a friend in a small, cozy coffee shop. Her friend, puzzled by Yu's decision to meet dog Ayo, asked why she had called for this impromptu meeting. Yu casually mentioned that she had broken up with Sok, shocking her friend. As they talked, Yu explained that Sok had fallen for Yura, leaving her no choice but to move on. Her friend's astonishment was evident, but Yu only laughed. The conversation turned to dog Aoyu. The heir to a wealthy family but known for his reckless behavior and obsession with gaming. Yu's friend was skeptical, but Yu seemed unfazed. She had a plan now, a vision for her future that didn't involve Seok or anyone else who had betrayed her. The past was behind her, and this new life was hers to shape. At an upscale event 2 days later, Yu found herself in the company of Dog Ayo, the younger son of the Sogging group, a man with a powerful presence and a well-tailored suit. He seemed like the perfect candidate for marriage, but as Yu scanned him, she recognized the same self-centered traits she had seen in Sog. Yet this time, Yu was different, no longer the naive girl from her past life, but someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Finally, Yu sat across from the guy her sister was interested in. After a brief conversation, Dogok tapped the table with a card, drawing Yu's gaze. He casually told her they should meet at the hotel later. Yu was stunned by his audacity and laughed to herself. Though she'd heard rumours that Dogok was arrogant, she hadn't expected him to be worse than those whispers. Dogok continued, saying he had also heard rumours about her. He understood she wasn't one of the easy ones. He smirked, remarking that Yu was actually quite the entertaining conversationalist. Immediately, Uppal joined in, rosing from the sofa. Front showed up convinced Uppal's math skills and completed their task. Uppel grinned and said it was just a meeting. Uppel raised an eyebrow and questioned whether he always had to be so direct. Uppel grinned and said it wasn't so bad, after all. Yu stared at him. I figured this was a test the moment we met, she said coolly. I'm not a fan of guys who flash a room key as their first move. Dogok, taken aback, tried to recover. He muttered that trusting his future to the woman who made him use that key on their first meeting didn't seem like a terrible idea. He met Yu's judgmental gaze, but couldn't read her expression. Yu stood up. I'm sorry, but I don't think I fit into the future you're imagining, she said. James Dogok, unfazed, wished her luck. Yu sighed deeply, deciding it was time to head home. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She spun around to see Yura standing there, with Seok at her side. The sight of them together made Yu's stomach churn. The reality of her memories hit her all at once. She froze. Yu knew she had to act, to show her sister that she was stronger. Without thinking, she turned back to Dogok, staring him down. Only one round for this test, right? At that moment, Yura noticed her sister in the cafe, her eyes widening as she saw Yu sitting with Dogok. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Dogok was confused by Yu's cryptic statement. One round? What do you mean? He asked. Before Yura could approach, Yura leaned forward, grabbed Dogok by the collar, and kissed him. His eyes shot wide open in shock. Across the cafe, Yura and Sok stood frozen, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Yura's face twisted from one of joy to one of disbelief and anger. Dogok, still processing the situation, suddenly realized that he was enjoying it. He reached out, cupping Yu's face as he deepened the kiss. Yu's eyes fluttered open, surprised by his reaction, but she didn't pull away. Until she finally remembered why she had started this in the first place. She broke away abruptly, wiping her lips in embarrassment, avoiding his gaze. Dogok blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend why Yu had stopped. Just then, Yura marched over, her expression stiff. What are you doing here, Mr. Dogok So? She stammered. Sok greeted Dogok, clearly just as surprised. Yura forced a smile and said it was quite the coincidence to run into Yu and Dogok here. Yu, turning to face Yu, simply asked what she was doing there with Sok. Before Yura could answer, Yura turned back to Dogok and smiled. Dinner tonight? She asked, teasingly handing him the room card. Dogok smirked. I think that sounds like a good idea. Yura and Sok exchanged confused glances as they watched Yu and Dogok continue their strange flirtation. Dogok took the card from Yu, and they both smiled at each other, leaving Yura fuming. The scene shifted to the hotel room. Dogok explained that it wasn't a suite, just a business room. He sighed and said, a business room. The number of women that have ever made it this far before. The number of... Yu interrupted, apologizing for the earlier kiss. She told him he was free to report it to Yura if he wanted to. Dogok chuckled, wiping his lips. What are you talking about? He asked. It wouldn't be as fun if we played by the rules. He leaned back, asking why Yu really wanted to meet him. Yu paused, then answered, because of the wedding. Dogok looked puzzled. Is there any other reason for a blind date? Yura turned away. Yura seems to like you, she said quietly. She turned back. Dogok raised an eyebrow. Is that why you wanted to marry me? Jean met her own reflection in the window. At first I thought it was about you, but now I'm thinking about starting a company. She turned back to face him, her eyes hard. I know about your grandfather's condition for investing. The condition is marriage. Once you get married, he'll let you start a venture. Dogok stared at her, processing her words in silence. Yu, sensing his hesitation, asked, "What do you think about that?" Dogok smiled, surprised by how well she knew his circumstances. Interesting, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. You talk like you know the future. Yu's phone suddenly vibrated, breaking the tension. Dogok glanced at it. Yu checked the caller. Yura. She immediately rejected the call. Dogok frowned. Why didn't you answer? Before she could respond, another call came in. It was Sok this time. Yu rejected it again and shrugged. Doesn't matter. Yu set her phone down and asked Dogok, "What are your plans for tonight?" She glanced up. "If you're free, we could spend the evening together." Then she felt his weight on her shoulder. Dogok's eyes widened, caught off guard. Wait, you saying we should sleep together? How? He burst out laughing, unable to contain himself. Jude stood there, puzzled, realizing too late the double meaning of her words. Flustered, she covered her face with her hand. Dogok, still chuckling, leaned forward, asking, "What exactly are you after, are you? A fake marriage, perhaps?" "I don't think I ask for much." He stared at her curiously. "And what do I get out of this deal?" The girl didn't know how to respond, and Dogok kept pressing her, asking what if he chose Yi over her. What was the difference? He asked her to prove that she was worth it, or maybe she could charm him enough for him to fall in love with her. U silently stared into his eyes, trying to think of something to say. However, she found herself amused by how similar Dogok was to her. It was entertaining. After a pause, U silently stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, deciding that wine might help them figure things out. She opened a bottle, poured a glass, and handed it to Dogok, remarking that if she were him, she would have bought Nova games instead of investing in hotel keys. Dogok was surprised by her comment, as he hadn't realized her interest in his business. He asked if she heard that from his manager, to which Yu responded by asking if he was the type of person who immediately ran to a supervisor when special issues came up. Dogok smiled, intrigued by her thoughts. Yu shouted. They continued drinking, and after a while the bottle was empty. U, tired, fell asleep in bed. Later she stirred, turning over and opening her eyes, only to be startled to find Dogok sleeping beside her. Even in his sleep he looked handsome. But then she noticed something. Her lipstick mark on his neck. Shocked and horrified, she started piecing together the events of the night. She had found Dogok's lip mark. She remembered them drinking together, her removing her coat and then throwing herself at him, saying she wanted to sleep. The memory made her blush. Deciding she needed to leave before Dogok woke up, she tiptoed around the room. But when Dogok shifted in his sleep, she jumped in fright, thinking he was awake. However, he remained asleep, much to her relief. Smiling at how handsome he looked even now, she left some money on the table to cover the cleaning costs and slipped out. As Yu drove away, her expression showed no sign of joy. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, her grandfather's hospital room. Upon entering, she saw him hooked up to an IV. He was surprised to see her and immediately took her hand, apologizing for everything. He told her she was his only granddaughter, repeating the apology over and over, with tears in his eyes. Yu felt a deep guilt. 3 months earlier, her grandfather had passed his entire inheritance to Ura, and Ura knew she needed to verify his words. She glanced around the room and saw his toothbrush, deciding to take it with her. As she reached for it, the door opened and Ura entered, addressing their grandfather. Ura smiled warmly at him, calling herself his granddaughter, and then started tending to him. Ura turned to Yu, remarking that she lacked respect for her elders and scolded her for not answering the phone yesterday. Yu sighed but pulled herself together, smiling confidently. She told her mother she was on a date last night. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she asked if the date was with Dogok from the sogging group. Yu laughed and confirmed it, though she wondered how her mother knew. Ura had mentioned it earlier. Yu smiled slyly, saying there would be good news soon. Meanwhile, at Dogok's office, a meeting was underway about the sales of the new game Golden Eye, which had increased by 22% in the first quarter. Despite the discussion, Dogok's mind wasn't on sales. He was still thinking about Yu. Her actions from the night before had puzzled him, especially the money she left behind with a note to cover cleaning and breakfast. As he reflected on her strange behavior, Dogok couldn't help but remember Yu's tipsy state the previous night. She had been talking, and whenever he turned away, she would yell at him, asking if he was paying attention. Rather than being annoyed, Dogok found it funny. Yu had summed up her life in a monologue, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Dogok if he could see memories. Dogok, staring at the floor, said he could. Yu had averted her gaze, confessing that there wasn't a single moment in her life that had truly hooked her. She asked Dogok how that could be, but he didn't have an answer for her. Frustrated, Yu had sighed and declared that this time it had to be different. Then, to Dogok's surprise, Yu suddenly got up, announcing she was going to bed. Dogok considered. Dogok was caught off guard by the abrupt change in conversation, especially when Yu started undressing. He tensed up, asking what she was doing. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to stop her from undressing, but she protested, screaming at him not to touch her. Dogok was trying to calm her down when he realized she still had a dress on under her coat. Relieved, he tried to compose himself, but Yu, in her drunken state, tripped over a chair and fell toward him. In a split second, Dogok couldn't catch her, and they both ended up on the bed. Yu, already half asleep, pressed herself against him. Dogok was left bewildered, his heart racing. He realized how much he liked her being close, but was also embarrassed by the situation. After a while, Yu rolled over to the other side, giving Dogok a chance to finally stand up. As he looked down at the sleeping girl, Dogok noticed something strange. A license plate on her hands caught his eye. He recognized the inscription. Looking at her, he whispered to himself that he didn't want to remember certain moments from his past either. Stroking her hair, Dogok promised himself that this time, things would be different. The scene shifted back to Dogok's office. It was already 10 a.m., and he hadn't received any calls from Yu, despite her mention of the wedding the day before. Just then, an employee interrupted Dogok's thoughts, asking if he was thinking about work or something else. The employee handed Dogok a tablet, congratulating him. On the screen was a news story titled, "Tycoon So Good," featuring a picture of Dogok and Yu. Immediately he started scanning the article, asking if it was about the second son of Sun Group. The guy responded that this wasn't the most important news at the moment. He warned the director that because of the criticism and scandal, the company could suffer losses. Suddenly, Dogok noticed the author of the article. It was his favorite cousin, Su Jan-non. After turning off the tablet and handing it back, Dogok asked if his assistant had contacted the girl. The assistant confirmed that he had and leaned in to share something even more interesting. He had found out that Dogok and the girl had gone to the same elementary school. Dogok asked if this meant they had a close relationship. The assistant clarified that they didn't, as they hadn't gotten along during that time. Dogok sighed, recognizing this as typical of Su Janan, and immediately asked his assistant to bring the reporter to him. The assistant hesitated and nervously asked if Dogok was planning to sleep with another girl. These words amused Dogok, and a smile spread across his serious face. A moment later, he burst out laughing, leaving the assistant bewildered. Suddenly, Dogok stood up, grabbed his jacket and started walking out. The secretary, confused, asked where he was going. Dogok turned, smiling, and said he was running away. Just as he reached the door, his assistant's eyes widened in fear, realizing it was too late. Someone was already there. The woman stood behind Dogok and asked where he was going. Turning in horror, Dogok greeted her sweetly, asking if she had arrived already. The woman, growing suspicious, asked if Dogok was planning to get married. He nervously confirmed, avoiding eye contact. The woman, frustrated, reminded him that he always avoided looking her in the eye when she asked that. Dogok sighed and admitted that even his father didn't know about it. This revelation shocked the woman, who demanded to know more. Dogok turned to his secretary and asked him to explain his nickname. Surprised, the secretary quietly explained that Dogok was asexual, had no sex drive, and was impotent. The woman was taken aback, utterly shocked by what she was hearing. Dogok smiled, explaining that he had lived with this condition his whole life and had to prove it to people. The woman, still in disbelief, asked if this was why Dogok wanted to get married. Dogok, seemingly unbothered, asked her why she had married his father, even though he already had a wife. In a fit of frustration, the woman slapped him, calling him a rude child. Dogok, stunned, watched as the woman angrily walked towards the elevator. Before she could leave, Dogok grabbed her arm and turned her around. He confidently told her that he would reclaim his father's company and win back both his father's love and his grandfather's legacy. The woman, unsure whether to believe him, asked what he meant. Dogok smiled sweetly, assuring her that he would make it happen. The scene shifted to a beautiful beach. Yu was on the phone, being asked where she had disappeared to. She calmly replied that she was at the beach, which shocked the person on the other end, who exclaimed that she must be crazy. Yu then confirmed that she was going to marry Dogok Aio. The friend on the phone, laughing, asked why she should help her. Yu sighed, hinting that she knew about her friend's secret relationship, which made the friend spit out her coffee in shock. The friend, panicking, asked how Yu knew. Yu reassured her that she wasn't following her, but added that the guy she was seeing had a pregnant girlfriend. The friend, horrified, asked if this was true, but Yu tried to downplay the situation. As the conversation continued, Yu suddenly spotted someone and abruptly ended the call. "If you think I'm lying, try and act out the conversation." Dogok stood in front of her, having finally found the girl who had been on his mind. He asked why she had stayed by the sea, admitting that he hated the beach. Avoided the question, asking why he had been looking for her. Dogok explained that she hadn't answered his calls, and that he wanted to return the money she had left. Yu, confused, told him there was no need to return anything. Dogok sighed, explaining that it was unusual for someone to leave a note and run away. Yu, taken aback by his confidence, jokingly asked if he had run out of money. Dogok smiled and admitted that he had suffered a loss, a significant one. He then reminded her that she had mentioned the wedding first, and he intended to take full responsibility. Although Yu was speechless, Dogok smiled and declared that there would indeed be a wedding. He thanked her for the incident and emphasized that her time was running out. If she didn't act soon, her sister would be the one standing next to him. Yu tensed, not wanting that outcome, and told him she understood. Dogok then invited her to have a meal with him, repeating the request when she hesitated. Yu, still uneasy, tried to refuse, claiming that she had her reasons for not eating with others. Dogok laughed, saying not to worry and that he would go first. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 bills, asking her to apologize properly for the kisses, the leaked photos, and the note. Tearing up the bills, he insisted that they should eat together, calling it the first condition of their wedding. The scene then shifted to a cafe where Yu looked around, unimpressed. She asked Dogok why food was the first condition for the wedding. He explained that if he hadn't insisted, they wouldn't be sitting together like this. Yu, frustrated, stared at the table. Dogok teased her, asking if the convenience store food was good enough for someone so squeamish. Yu, still irritated, admitted that at least the convenience store food didn't require her to check the cooking process. Dog noticed that Yu was upset about something and asked her what was wrong. She replied that she would be more downcast when rumors spread that the tycoon's son was now with an adopted girl. Dog tilted his head and found it interesting. Yu looked at him questioningly. Dog asked if he really looked like the biggest villain in the tycoon family, suggesting that maybe the girl was just crazy. Changing the topic, Yu asked if she had done something unnecessary that day. Dirk looked unsure and asked what she was talking about. Yu, flustered, clarified she meant the day at the hotel when they had drinks together. Dirk laughed, surprised that Yu probably didn't remember anything. He teased her, saying they were quite close that day. For example, Yu hugged him, left a kiss mark, and they even slept together. Shocked by his words, Yu hit the table and told him to stop. Duke switched the subject, asking why she was eating so little and whether she had already eaten today. Annoyed, Yu told him not to change the subject and added that it was her food, so she knew better. Duke acknowledged her point, but asked out of curiosity what kind of guys she liked. Yu, puzzled, said she had no preference and asked why he was suddenly asking. Duke asked how he measured up as a boyfriend. Yu's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked him to clarify. Duek said he was starting to like her a little, which is why he was curious about her thoughts. Receiving no answer, he asked again if she didn't have any thoughts about him. Yu stared at him, bewildered. Duek continued, saying they were going to get married, and people usually marry someone they like. Wasn't that right? Yu replied that such things were a waste of time and bad for business, but it wasn't the only response he left to the article either. Dirk smiled sarcastically, expressing regret. He was even feeling a little nervous. He started tapping the table and began to mention that night again, but I cut him off sharply, telling him to stop talking nonsense. Dirk smiled, noting that he hadn't even said anything yet. Ben smiled too, noting that I hadn't even faltered. How was it that she managed to slip up too? Yu noticed that Doek was staring at something on her hands. Looking down, she realized it was the strange inscription that appeared after death. Quickly, she covered it with her sweater sleeve, not wanting him to see it. She asked if he had noticed anything on her wrist. Doek, puzzled, asked if she was hiding something. Yu averted her gaze and said it was nothing. Doek, deciding to change the subject, asked if they could talk about something more important. Yu, serious now, said WJ Retail was about to fail financially, which was why Duik needed a marriage with Yura. Duik confirmed that he had insisted on the marriage as it would help him attract more investors. He explained that marriage was one of the conditions under which his grandfather would invest in the company and, if things went well, he could eventually control the company's shares. Yu smiled and revealed that she had already bought 5% of the shares and that they would sell out quickly as soon as WJ Retail's stock dropped. Dek was impressed by her foresight, but noted that it might take 30 years to achieve that goal. Yu smiled again and said that's why she needed him, so he would invest in her company. Puzenia nochot kasmia vidlacha convenjus kovortsalenda games. Tucha considered whether WJ Retail was worth the investment. Yu promised that he wouldn't regret it. Tucha considered whether she wouldn't regret it. Tushon talme Yu uninterested in their games, refused. Yu, uninterested in their games, refused. Tucha continued that what they were doing wasn't much different from playing a game, where there was a 50/50 chance of getting caught. Yu, undeterred, confidently replied that they would succeed no matter what. Suddenly, Yu received a message saying the results of a requested DNA test would be known in 2 weeks. Yu was thrilled, but tried to hide her excitement. Deok noticed her happiness and quietly said he was happy for her. Yu looked at him questioningly. He smiled, saying he liked her plan and encouraged her to keep trying. Deok stood up, and Yu realized her plan had failed. He mockingly told her that if she wanted to marry him so badly, she should propose. Yu shouted in disbelief, asking what he was talking about. Deok continued, saying that in that case they'd need wedding rings. No kissing, though. Yu, shocked, started laughing nervously, saying that since it was necessary for the marriage, she would do everything required. Nook didn't expect that response. Yu held out her hand and declared that it was a proposal. Later, Yu drove home, deep in thought about the mystery surrounding her grandfather's death and the transfer of the inheritance to Ura. She feared the suicide note was forged and resolved to uncover the truth. As soon as she entered the house, her stepmother slapped her hard, shouting at her for not answering the phone and worrying everyone. Rubbing her cheek, Yu realized she had been wrong to think this woman was her biological mother. Her stepmother, arms crossed, said that legally she was still Yu's mother, unless Yu had found someone else. Yu retorted, asking if it was okay for Yura to have an unlawful relationship with a man. Her stepmother was furious, unable to believe what she had just heard. Yu sharply grabbed her mother's hand, saying she knew exactly who she was. The stepmother who had raised her since she was 9, and Yu added that she would marry Ju. Their conversation was interrupted by Yu's father, who came in and demanded that they stop arguing. He scolded Yu for how she was speaking to her mother. Yu, feeling betrayed, argued that she was his daughter too, but her father sternly told her she wasn't like Yura and expressed disappointment in her. Yu was devastated. Then, her stepmother, trying to calm things, apologized to her husband, taking the blame. The father left, telling Yu she'd be staying home for a while. Yu stood there, eyes downcast, feeling utterly defeated. The man, just as he was leaving, turned around and mentioned that she would be home for a while. Yu stood still, her eyes downcast, staring at the floor. The woman sighed softly and called for the 2 maids. As they approached Yu, one of them tried to remove the bag from her shoulder. Yu screamed, insisting she could do it herself. She then pulled her phone out of the bag, holding it out while warning the maid not to touch it. After this, Yu retreated to her room, and her stepmother smiled awkwardly at her outburst. Once inside her room, Yu shut the door behind her. The situation felt surreal. She hadn't thought she'd ever return to this place, yet here she was, driven by a new sense of purpose. She opened her drawer and began rummaging through her clothes, scattering them across the floor. Tying the shirts together, she approached the window, eyeing the height. It wasn't high, but it wasn't low either. Carefully, Yu began to lower her makeshift rope. At first, everything went smoothly, but then her foot slipped, and she plummeted toward the ground before she could grab hold of the rope again. Her eyes filled with fear, and for a brief moment, memories from her past flashed through her mind. The terrifying moment when she was hit by a car. She shut her eyes tightly, wondering if this was death coming for her again. Suddenly, a hand reached out, catching her before she hit the ground. It was the guard, who had luckily been nearby. Gently, he placed her on the ground, then looked at her intently and asked if she had been trying to escape. He added that if she truly sought revenge, she should stay in the house to achieve it. Yu looked at him, confused. Revenge wasn't on her mind. What did he know? The man adjusted his glasses, suggesting her actions weren't befitting of someone like her. Frustrated, Yu told him not to pretend he knew her or her motives. The man smiled and offered his hand. Yu's head was pounding, and she struggled to stand. She asked for her phone, and the man handed it to her, after asking what she planned to do. With a calm but determined tone, Yu replied, "To take revenge." He smiled knowingly and reminded her that he had, after all, advised her to stay. At that moment, the man pressed the intercom button, and a voice asked who was there. Dog Ao greeted them, holding a stunning bouquet of roses. When Yu's stepmother opened the door, she was stunned. What he had said was indeed coming true. Dog Ao smiled warmly and asked if he could come inside. The whole family, except Yu, gathered around the table. Dog Ao apologized for arriving unannounced, but the father waved it off, assuring him that the article wasn't worth worrying about. Dog Ao smiled awkwardly, apologizing again, but the father confirmed he'd seen the article and noted that such things were published nowadays without real evidence. Dog Ao nodded, adding that sometimes it's necessary to get rid of something, even if it's the truth. The stepmother couldn't hold back any longer and asked if the article was indeed true. Dog Ao glanced around and asked where Yu was. The stepmother forced a smile and replied that Yu had left early that morning, but Dog Ao, sipping his coffee, wasn't convinced. The father reassured him that he had already spoken to Yu and everything was fine, but Dog Ao said the opposite, that he was the reason Yu had become involved. The room turned tense. The father asked what Dog Ao meant, and after a moment, Dog Ao confessed that the article was true. Meanwhile, the guard quietly stood outside Yu's room, working discreetly to pick the lock. After a successful click, he opened the door and told Yu it was time. She agreed, saying it was time to show her family who she truly was. She walked silently down the hallway, past the guard. The family was still talking with Dog Ao, but the stepmother spotted Yu out of the corner of her eye and became furious. How had she escaped the locked room? Yu looked radiant, her hair gleaming in the sunlight and her simple dress highlighting her figure. The conversation halted abruptly as everyone noticed her, except Dog Ao, who smiled and commented that Yu must have been there all along. The stepmother seethed, while the father only frowned. She left. Yu pulled out a chair and sat beside Dog Ao. They exchanged smiles, glad to be in each other's presence. Dog Ao then boldly announced that he wanted to marry Yu. The room fell silent. The stepmother and daughter were completely stunned by his declaration. When pressed, Dog Ao explained that he had no other choice but to marry for love, not for political gain. He glanced at Yu, reaffirming his intentions, and Yu's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. The stepmother, visibly shaken, objected, pointing out that Yu had recently been through a breakup and couldn't possibly be ready for a relationship. Yu's father agreed, suggesting it might be best for her to move on from recent events before rushing into anything new. Yu, now tense, lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. Dog Ao took Yu's hand, promising to help her figure out what she truly wanted. He then stood, ready to leave, telling Yu they had reservations at a restaurant. Moments later, they were in his car, speeding down the road. Yu, still processing everything, asked him directly what his price was. Dog AIO laughed, reminding her that they had already discussed this. At the restaurant, Yu felt uncomfortable, not used to being treated so delicately in such a public setting. She distracted herself by scrolling through her phone, but when she opened a message from Sujan, she realized there had been no response. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dog AIO asked if she was going to eat. Wu assured him she was fine, but was clearly struggling to relax. When dessert arrived, Wu's discomfort only grew, her mind still elsewhere. After seeing the dessert, Yu's expression changed, and Dogok, noticing her reaction, looked a bit perplexed and asked if something was wrong. Yu began trembling uncontrollably, her mind drifting into a memory. In her recollection, a woman offered her the same dessert, smiling sweetly and urging her to open her mouth. Yu, surprised but trusting, told her mother that it tasted. She didn't get to finish her sentence. Her face twisted into horror and pain, and she collapsed to the ground, desperately calling for her mother, her hands clutching her throat as she coughed violently. Something was burning her throat. Frantically, she asked why the dessert tasted so strange. The woman, hovering over her, coldly asked why Yu called her mum, when she should only be addressed as auntie or ma. Snapped back to the present, staring in horror at the dessert in front of her, the memory of it being poisoned flooding her mind. That same woman had disliked her so much that she'd poisoned her. Dogok, still confused, asked again what she was thinking about. A little shaken, replied that everything was fine, and turned her head to look out at the evening cityscape. Sensing the tension, Dogok commented that if she didn't want the dessert, he'd gladly eat it. Yu turned back to watch him, her eyes wide with anxiety. As soon as he took a bite, Yu's heart raced, her eyes fixated on him, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Dogok smiled, swallowing his bite, and said if she was remembering something painful, she could share it with him. Yu was surprised by his words but touched. Few people ever showed concern for her like this. It was something entirely new for her. After a brief pause, Dogok looked around and smiled, saying this seemed like the perfect place to propose. He then asked if she had prepared the wedding rings and a kiss. Yu, taken aback, thought he was joking, but to her surprise, Dogok got up from his chair and knelt in front of her, wide, dark eyes fixed on Ben's plate. The colour was darkening around his cheeks as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "What are you doing?" she asked nervously. Dogok smiled, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the dim restaurant lights. "I'm making a real proposal," he said, his voice calm yet serious. Dogok then asked, "Will you marry me?" Before she could fully process what was happening. The ring was already on her finger. Suddenly, Yu asked if Dogok knew she was a zobik, someone who avoided kissing for hygiene reasons and had a strong aversion to uncleanliness. Dogok, taken aback, laughed and asked, "What about the evening we had?" Yu, feeling a little flustered, brushed it off, saying it was just business. Dogok smirked, leaning in and teasingly said, "Well, since it was just business, then..." Before he could finish, Yu grabbed him by the shirt, interrupting him, and declared that since she hadn't proposed, she had prepared a kiss instead. She pulled Dogok close and kissed him gently, standing on her toes to reach him. Dogok's bewildered expression softened as he began to enjoy the moment. Their lips, once inseparable, finally parted. Embarrassed, Wu stepped back, saying, "That's enough for now." But Dogok, not ready to let the moment end, pulled her back by the waist and kissed her again. The scene shifted to Dogok's office on a bright sunny day. Dogok was scrolling through the social news feed when suddenly he saw a photo of himself and Yu kissing. Did he really get caught again? Just then his secretary walked in and teased that the director had become a celebrity. Dogok jumped, startled by the news. The secretary went on, saying it was now official. The director was a public figure. Dogok sighed, understanding the situation. After a moment, the secretary asked if Dogok wanted him to handle the article, maybe even asking Sujan, the reporter, to delete it. Or should he, jokingly, cut off Sujan's middle finger as a warning? Dogok tensed at the second suggestion, saying the first option would do just fine. At that moment, a notification popped up on Dogok's phone. It was a message from Yu asking him to have lunch together. The request left Dogok speechless. Yu? Inviting him to lunch? Without hesitation, Dogok responded that he'd be happy to join her. His heart raced as he turned to his secretary seeking advice. "If a girl invites you to lunch, doesn't that mean she's interested?" he asked. The secretary, pondering, cautiously replied, "Probably." Dogok, unsure, pressed further. The secretary finally relented, adding, "As your brother-in-law, I'd say don't get your hopes up too soon." Dogok, a bit taken aback, laughed nervously. Dogok was leaving his office, heading toward the exit where Yu was supposed to be waiting for him. As he walked, he told himself it would be best to avoid drawing too much attention. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out to him. Thinking it was Yu, he lifted his head with a smile, only to find Yuru standing in front of him, smiling brightly. She began walking towards him, and as she did, memories flooded back. In the past, a younger Yu stood off to the side, scuffing the ground with the toe of her sneaker, watching her sister Yuru from afar. Yuru had wanted to approach her, to reach out, but she had barely taken a single step when their mother pulled her back. The woman gestured toward the vast estate around them, telling Yuru that everything she saw now belonged to her. Then, pointing to the lonely Yu, she coldly remarked that Yu wasn't real, unlike Yuru, who was the real one. It wasn't the first time their mother had said something like this, and each time she would ask Yuru if she understood. As Yuru walked toward Dogok in the present, she thought about all the things her mother had said, how they were, in a way, true. She had everything, the real things. Now, here she was, standing right in front of Dogok, who was clearly surprised by her sudden appearance. She was deep in thought, feeling that Ura didn't deserve him. Breaking the silence, the girl greeted Dogu and reminded him that it was nearly lunchtime. AA suggested that if Dogu had no plans, they could have lunch together. Looking questioningly at Ura, Dogu asked if she meant him. The girl smiled, confirming she had come to meet him and have lunch. Realizing there was a reason behind her visit, Dogu playfully asked if she wanted to eat or get married at the same time. The unexpected question left the girl momentarily stunned. But just a moment later, like her mother, Ura composed herself, smiling, and replied that they could eat first and then get married. As she sank into her memories, the girl recalled how everything in that house had been hers since the day she arrived. Everything in the WJ retail family belonged to her. She was always showered with gifts during the holidays and had never felt inferior to anyone. Her wealthy, tycoon father ensured she received all the love she needed, along with the ideal, socially imposed image of a family. But for Ura, it was all about furthering her legacy, and she wasn't going to let anyone else have it, especially not her obsessive, perpetually disgruntled sister, Dog. Upple remembered the day they first met. She'd been angrily scrolling through social media when she heard a pleasant male voice. She turned to see a tall, handsome brunette who immediately apologized for being late. Unlike anyone she'd met before, he was captivating. Looking into his eyes for the first time, Aura realized he had everything she wanted. They spoke for hours, discussing various topics. Aura mentioned how she believed marriage should be between people of the same status who got along well. Dog accepted her offer of coffee, but when he set his mug down, he told her bluntly that he wasn't thinking about marriage. Shocked, the girl jumped up and questioned him. Standing from the table, Dog said he had no choice but to attend this meeting because his mother had requested it. As she tried to change his mind, Dogok cut her off, saying he didn't want a political marriage. Even though his words hurt, Ura still found him irresistible. She decided then and there that Dogo Ayo would be her husband, no matter what. But as she thought back to that day, Ura struggled to understand why Yu and Dorguk were together. Why had they kissed that day? Why had he gone to her family's house and asked for permission to marry Yu on the same day? Seeing them hold hands, Ura couldn't keep her composure. She was filled with confusion and frustration, wondering why he chose Yu over her. Clenching her trembling fists, Ura knew taking him away wouldn't be easy. Returning to reality, she told Dogok they should eat first and then discuss marriage. But Dogok, clearly irritated, scratched his neck and said he wasn't interested in doing either. Smiling and looking into his eyes, Ura insisted she wanted a wedding. He averted his gaze, confused by her persistence. Turning back to her, he explained awkwardly that he already had a girlfriend. Surprised, Ura asked if he was truly going to marry her sister. Laughing, Dog folded his arms and pointed out that Ura was now trying to stop him. Suddenly, Ura began shouting across the floor that Yu had someone else, claiming her sister was only using Dogu for revenge. Taken aback, Dogu asked if Ura really believed that, if he didn't marry U, she should be the next option. The girl hadn't expected such a response, and looked at him with horror as the crowd in the building stared. Dogok, with a slight smirk, told Ura that he admired her boldness. He glanced at his watch, apologized, and added that he didn't have time to listen to Ura's tales. Without hesitation, he moved toward the exit, saying he had to leave. Ura quickly turned, trying to stop him, but Sudok interrupted, stating that he already had someone he was meeting for lunch. Curious, she asked who it was. He paused and, with a smile, asked if she truly didn't know. Then, turning back to her, he said he was going to have lunch with someone who often had trouble eating. The scene shifts back a few hours to the WJ retail estate, where Yu had just woken up, startled by an early phone call. Sleepily, she reached for her phone, struggling to identify the caller. Her eyes suddenly widened in shock. A picture of her kissing Dogu had been sent to her, with a message asking if it was a good photo. The sender casually mentioned that her brother was preparing a ring, and they had helped him a little. Yu immediately jumped up, trying to piece together the events of the previous night, recalling how Dogok had proposed and kissed her. Covering her mouth, she realized that he had orchestrated the whole thing in advance. The action then moved to Dogok's building, where Sadhu was heading to a meeting, her thoughts consumed by the morning's events. She tried to reassure herself that this was just business and that there must have been a reason for his proposal. It didn't matter who started it. Business was business. As she lost herself in these thoughts, someone called out her name. She looked up to see Seo, her ex-husband, surprised to see her. Yu wasn't thrilled by this encounter and didn't want to engage, so she lowered her head and walked past him. Zor quickly grabbed her arm, asking if she had come to meet Direct Sol and whether they were truly getting married. Annoyed, U pulled her hand away and confirmed it. Sol, frustrated, began shouting, demanding to know what had happened to her. U laughed bitterly, telling him it didn't matter. She already knew Sol had been in love with Ura. Sol was shocked by her words, unable to comprehend how she knew. But Yu expected this reaction and, with little hope in her expression, told him to go talk to Ura. She didn't want him anywhere near her. As she walked away, Seo, still in shock, remarked that Yu had changed. Yu turned and replied that she hadn't changed at all. Seo, however, who had felt nothing from the beginning and was only now trying to fix things, was the one who had changed. Seo was dumbfounded and had no idea how Yu knew all this. He recalled the moment after Yu had left him, telling him that their marriage was over. His grandfather couldn't believe it, questioning Seo repeatedly. A frustrated Seo tried to explain but couldn't finish before his grandfather's hand shot out and struck him across the face, hard. "You're nothing," the old man spat, angry that Seo couldn't hold on to Yu. He asked if dissolving the marriage was all Seo could do. The family was horrified, especially Seo's mother, who tearfully asked what they would do now with the deposit for the store already paid. She pounced on him, demanding answers. Just then, Seo's sister burst in, asking what would happen to her fancy bag and GG dress. The family's overwhelming expectations fell heavily on Seo's shoulders, with everyone urging him to win Yu back at any cost. Seo, staring down at the floor, tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong and when it had all fallen apart. The scene shifts again, and now Seo is outside, talking with Ura. She casually mentioned that Seo was like family to her, and he smiled, feeling encouraged. Ura held his hand and spoke of how great it would be if they became one family. Confused, Seo agreed, only for Ura to suggest that they could become a family if he married her sister. Seo, bewildered, asked what her sister had to do with it. Ura held his hand tighter and, surprised, asked, "Don't you want to marry Ura?" Seo was taken aback. This girl, who had been sweet-talking him and hanging out with him, was now suggesting he marry her sister. Nevertheless, after a moment of contemplation, Seo turned away and gravely agreed to marry Ura. Overjoyed, began praising him, calling him the best. Seo, meanwhile, realized he had no choice but to move closer to Ura's family. His thoughts drifted back to that night of confession, the night he had spent with Ura. Looking out the window, she talked about how she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. She mentioned how sharing a room or a bed with anyone made her uncomfortable. Her boyfriend smiled and reassured her that he was fine with it. He still wanted to be with her. As he stared at the floor, he realized that things had turned out just as Yu had said. Maybe it was for the best, though there was one thing that continued to stress him out. One afternoon, Ura urgently called Seo, asking him to come over as soon as possible. When she got into the car, Seo immediately asked her what had happened and why she needed him so suddenly. Without much thought, Ura started shouting that Yu was going to marry Dog Ao. Grabbing Seo by his jacket, she begged him for help, saying that he was on her side. She tearfully confessed that she knew Yu still cared about her, and even more, she believed Yu liked her too. Ura desperately asked Seo to bring Yu back. Disheartened, Seo looked down and asked if Ura would marry Dogok if Yu didn't return. Ura sighed heavily, tears welling up in her eyes, and said that she would have to, because it was all for the family business. Anne, from what Seo did when she arrived, asked why she was pretending that Dogok didn't like her. He started shouting, telling her that she needed Dogok and he could see it clearly. Sighing heavily again, Seo realized he had no other choice. Reluctantly, he agreed to help and said he would try to convince Yu to come back to her. Ura's expression instantly changed from desperation to joy, and she thanked him profusely. As Seo watched her happiness, he thought to himself that if this was the only way to make her happy, then so be it. The scene shifted to the hospital. It was a sunny, bright day, perfect for Yu to get her test results. She had just left the building, holding an envelope with the results inside. Unable to wait any longer, she stopped and opened it. As her eyes scanned the paper, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. It revealed that Anan, the man she came to see, was 99.9% confirmed to be her biological father. Yu dropped the envelope, struggling to process the news. How could this have happened? Suddenly, it hit her. The unpleasant woman, Zhang Hai, must have known all along. Even her wool-covered life had been a forgery, a complete fraud. Yu looked up at the sky and laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. It hurt to realize that she would only learn about her real father's identity after his death. Later, Yu found herself standing in front of her house. The journey home had been difficult, and she was emotionally drained. As she reached for her keys, someone called out to her from behind. It was her ex-husband Sio's unpleasant relatives. They forced smiles, pretending to care about her well-being. Yu looked at them with disdain and asked what they wanted. Sio's mother began speaking, hesitantly, bringing up the topic of the marriage dissolution. She stumbled over her words, but eventually said they had come because they were worried. Seo stood emotionless as the woman continued pestering her with questions, trying to understand if Yu and Seo had fought. When the woman suggested they should simply ignore the rumors, her daughter Sei chimed in, saying, "All couples fight before they get married." Yu, already irritated by their presence, was growing increasingly stressed. Suddenly, Sei approached her and took her hand, suggesting they all go out to eat together to lift her mood. Without a second thought, Yu yanked her hand away and made it clear that she had no intention of going anywhere with them. Feeling cornered, Sio's mother then mentioned something about a contract. She hesitated but eventually blurted out that she was considering returning it, and, in fact, had taken out a loan. She sighed and said that everything was falling apart at the worst possible time. Yu, without any emotion, firmly said no and advised the woman to get a job. Turning away, she declared the conversation over and said there was nothing more to discuss. Just as Yu started walking away, the woman suddenly grabbed her arm and pleaded, asking if Yu wanted her to apologize. She begged Yu to reconsider the marriage, insisting that, although she didn't know what had happened between them, not all hope was lost. Looking at her ex-husband's family, Yu calmly stated that they no longer had anything to do with her. With that, she turned towards the door and began unlocking it. As a final statement, she made it clear that she had no intention of marrying Suk. Suk's mother, seemingly resigned, nodded and said she understood, but she hoped their promise still stood. Yu turned around, bewildered, as the woman, now on her knees, continued to plead. She promised she would give everything back, if only Yu would reconsider. Yu, tired of the theatrics, asked directly how the woman planned to return the money. Suk's mother, embarrassed, looked away, unable to answer. Yu sighed, telling them that once again they shouldn't count on her. Turning around, she told them to talk to her son instead. Her disheveled woman lowered her head, and Sei, horrified, asked her mother what they should do next. Suddenly, Suk's mum snapped. Grinding her teeth, she lunged at Yu, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her forward. The woman unleashed a tirade, bitterly complaining that Yu didn't even remember her birthday. She ranted that Yu was an ill-mannered girl who didn't know basic etiquette. Yu tried to break free but couldn't. Then she noticed something. A security camera. Realizing they were now out of frame, Yu knew she had to move. Slowly she started backing up, inch by inch, until she was back in view. Sei, witnessing the scene, stepped between her mother and Yu, trying to stop the chaos. but Suk's mother was beyond reason. At the last moment, she swung her arm wildly. There was a tense silence as her hand connected with Yu's face. The woman stood there, satisfied, while Yu stared at her, unfazed. Rather than reacting with anger, Yu began to laugh. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Lifting her hair to reveal the forming bruise, Yu asked the woman and Sei if they realized what had just happened. Her expression shifted, becoming sharper and more confident, as she coldly stated that physical assault had just occurred. Sok's mum, still fuming, demanded to know what Yu was talking about. But before she could finish, Sei called out to her mother, pointing upwards. There, hanging above them, was a camera. Sei tried to step away, but then came over quickly. She smirked, while being unsteady. "We are in the frame," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "It means I'll have fun with this now." Sei tried to take them to the police. Panic set in as Sei frantically begged Yu to forget the incident. Sei tried pulling her mother towards the door, urging her to leave. Wu exhaled, relieved. This nightmare was finally over. Just as she reached the doorstep, a man appeared, blocking her way. He asked how she was doing. Wu, slightly taken aback, asked who had sent him. Was it Grandpa? The man silently nodded. Yu then asked how her grandfather was doing, and the bodyguard replied that he was doing much better. Wu hesitated before asking if he would be able to travel to Seoul. The bodyguard said he wasn't sure. As Yu walked past him, the man suddenly turned and asked if it was true that Yu was getting married. Yu, surprised by the question, hesitated, but then confirmed it. The man looked at her, expressionless, and remarked that he hoped the man she was marrying was a worthy replacement for Yusok. Yu was puzzled by his words, recalling the strange things he had said before, like the time he caught her when she was about to fall, or the moment he advised her to stay home if she truly wanted revenge. Then she remembered the day of her father's death. That moment in the car, when she saw a missed call from Juanon, wondering why he had called her in the first place. The scene shifted to a small but charming restaurant. Dogok entered and was greeted warmly by his family, who were already gathered there. His mother beamed, proudly mentioning that she never dreamed her son would finally find a good bride. Dogok smiled, but quickly changed the subject, saying there was something he wanted for himself. As Dogok's sister joined the conversation, the mood shifted. She teased him about going crazy over this girl he liked. Dogok interrupted, starting to tell his story, even though his family already knew quite a bit about the girl. His mother frowned and mentioned that she had heard Yu wasn't exactly a decent girl, asking if she was an orphan. Dogok, irritated, picked up his glass and thought to himself that Yu was far from someone to be talked about like that. Abruptly, his mother slammed her fist on the table, declaring that there would be no marriage with Yu. His father, unfazed, sipped his coffee and said that Dogok could do whatever he wanted. The argument escalated, with his mother yelling, but his father calmly reminded her that Dogok's choices were his own. Dogok watched his parents quarrel, thinking back to how he had always been on his own, making decisions by himself. Finally, Dogok stood up, wishing his family a pleasant meal, and prepared to leave. Just then, Donya, his sister, excitedly announced that their older brother was arriving. The door opened, and a joyful man entered, laughing and greeting everyone. Dogok, however, was less than thrilled at his brother's arrival. The scene shifted back to WJ Retail, where Yu sat on her cozy bed, reading. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening startled her, and she jumped. Yura stood before her, explaining that Seok had arrived and was waiting for her. Yu, frustrated, said she didn't want to see him. She reminded Yu that Seok had betrayed her and demanded to know what he wanted. Ura explained that Seok had come to talk, and you, without hesitation, told her to send him away. There was nothing to discuss. But Ura, defiant, said she would let him in anyway. Moments later, Sok peeked in through the door and smiled. Barely containing her anger, Yu asked why he couldn't respect her wishes. She sarcastically wondered if Ura had put him up to this. Sok, surprised, remained silent, confirming her suspicions. U sighed, her frustration evident. Sok approached her, pleading for another chance, apologizing for the past, and promising he would never hurt her again. Said frosty lips. But Yu, tired of his words, pulled her hand away and coldly told him to get out. Seok, devastated, fell to his knees, begging her not to marry Dogok, saying it would break his heart. Yu, baffled by his audacity, asked what he was even talking about. Seok, desperate, said he would pretend it never happened, and in that moment, proposed to her. Yu jumped at the turn of events and asked Sok why he was looking at the girl with such intense eyes. He responded that she understood everything and he still liked her. The girl, however, met Sok's gaze with disgust and distress, immediately recalling a day filled with overwhelming emotions. She remembered her sister and ex-husband, a couple once in love, and how he swore his love for her sister. As these memories surfaced, the girl began to smile madly and told Sok it was all a farce. It amused her to watch him pretend to care, but she wasn't willing to pretend anymore. With anger, she accused him of being at fault. Seok tried to reason with her, saying she wasn't like this before. Just then, something small hit him. He picked it up and asked what it was. U revealed that her family had visited her recently and handed him a flash drive, warning him that tampering with it would be unwise. It was just a copy. Looking at Seok's disappointment, she told him next time she wouldn't hesitate to go to the police. Defeated, Seok left the room in a fury. As Sok stormed out, Ura was walking down the corridor with a tray of water meant for Sok and Yu. She was puzzled by how quickly he left, but continued on to the room. Once inside, Ura sat across from Yu, confessing that her thoughts had been troubling her for days. She couldn't understand why Yu had supported her meeting with Dogok. Ura asked if her sister had led her down this path. Yu, bewildered, reflected on what Ura had said. It had all happened before her death and awakening. Ura mentioned how she noticed they were treated differently. Yu was constantly ignored, while she was praised. Yu smiled at the comment and said Ura didn't truly understand. Their mother had always said Yu was fake, not real, like Ura. As Ura processed this, Ura reminded her that she could do what she wanted now. Yu seemed to take pleasure in this idea, and without warning, splashed water onto her sister. Shocked, Ura demanded to know what Yu was doing, but Yu only laughed, reminding her that she had given permission to let go. Yu thanked her sister for the encouragement, and ominously added that this was just the beginning, worse things were coming. She even claimed that Dogok would be her husband. Horrified, Ura screamed that Yu couldn't be with him, but Yu coldly told her not to be jealous. Ura, desperate to understand, asked about Sok. They had been planning to marry. Yu calmly replied that she knew Sok loved her sister, which is why she ended things with him. Suddenly, Ura's anger surged, and she grabbed a glass of water, dumping it on U. Now both sisters were drenched, but while Ura was distraught, U only smiled, victorious. At that moment, a male voice interrupted them. It was Dogok. He looked perplexed, asking if the sisters were fighting. Embarrassed, they blushed as he entered the room, mentioning that he didn't realize he was such a frequent topic of conversation. Dogok handed Yu a napkin, wiping the water from her face, which made Yura seethe with jealousy. To her, Yura didn't deserve such care from Dogok, yet here he was, attending to her. He then asked the girl if she was okay. Yu looked carefully into his eyes, but then turned her head, noticing her stepmother in the doorway, furious. Seeing her stepmother's expression lifted Yu's mood. She told Dogok she wasn't feeling well, taking his hands in hers, and said that things weren't good at all. She pulled him closer, asking for a hug. Dogok, puzzled, hesitated for a moment before they found themselves sitting together in the car. Outside, heavy rain poured down. As they drove, Dogok commented that Yu was quite the actress. She sighed, admitting she had no choice. Silence filled the car as Yu stared out at the passing scenery. Suddenly, Dogok broke the silence by revealing that he had a similar situation with his older brother. Surprised, Yu turned to him, and Dogok explained that they had different mothers. In front of others, his brother pretended to be nice and perfect, but in reality, no one knew his true nature. Yu tried to recall his brother's name. Was it Jang Woko? Dogok confirmed that his brother wasn't perfect at all. With an angry look, he added that his brother was only genuine with him and no one else. Yu didn't know how to respond to Dogok's story, so she remained silent. They continued driving through the heavy rain, and Yu couldn't help but notice how serious and reliable Dogok seemed. She found herself thinking about how handsome he was. After a while, Yu coughed and asked where they were headed. Dogok laughed and told her it was a bit late to ask. Pointing to a building, he said that this was their new home, where they would live together. Yu screamed in bewilderment, asking if he had just picked her up and brought her here without telling her. Dogok calmly replied that if they didn't like it, they could leave. But Yu hesitated, not wanting to follow him. Ignoring her reluctance, Dogok told her to come along and stop freaking out unnecessarily. Soon they were standing in front of the door to their new apartment on the 5th floor. As they approached the door, Dogok asked if she remembered the day at the hotel. Confused, Yu asked him to clarify. Smiling, he said the password was the date they first met at the hotel. Exhausted, Yu asked if that date had any special meaning. Opening the door, Dogok confirmed it did. It was the night they spent together. She stopped at the threshold, her mind flashing back to that night. The night had been relatively normal, but she shuddered at the memory of the morning after and the lipstick mark on her neck. Snapping back to reality, she decided to forget it as soon as possible. As they entered the apartment, Yu couldn't help but notice how beautifully it was decorated. The renovation was perfect. She was puzzled and asked if Dogok really lived there. He confirmed that he did, and asked what she didn't like about it. Yu, still in shock, admitted she liked everything. Then her eyes landed on one particular room. It was entirely pink. She asked, bewildered, why everything in the room was pink. At first, Dogok didn't understand her question. Dogok then said that it was Yu's room. She cried out in disbelief, looking at the cute bear and the rest of the decorations. Dogok was proud of himself, clearly pleased with the renovation, but Yu was shocked, to say the least. She burst out laughing uncontrollably, asking whose idea it was. Confused, Dogok watched her. Yu thanked him for preparing the room for her, but wondered why he chose pink. Such a stereotypical colour. Dogok quickly explained that he hadn't thought much about it, but his sister had strongly recommended the style, which was suggested by his secretary and his wife. Feeling a bit frustrated, he added that if she didn't like it, he could change the room and this time ask for her input. Not lingering in the room for long. Next they went to the kitchen. Yu looked around, pleasantly surprised, and commented that she liked the interior. Dogok smiled and asked her to sit at the table while he cooked something for them. Yu's expression immediately changed, and with horror she asked if he was really going to cook. Dogok replied that he was, since she hadn't eaten anything all day. Yu reminded him that she doesn't eat with others, and was upset that he had forgotten, or maybe never remembered at all. Dogok, tying his apron, reassured her that he remembered and boasted that he could cook better than even the most expensive hotels. But Yu stood her ground, insisting that she doesn't eat food cooked by other people. Curious, Dogok asked why she had such a rule. Yu frowned, then looked down, frustrated. She explained that it was because she couldn't trust anyone. She remembered a childhood incident when her stepmother had poisoned a seemingly ordinary dessert. Every time she recalled the event, she shivered, and from that moment she stopped trusting anyone who gave her food. Dogok, feeling slightly offended, asked if she couldn't trust men too. He looked at her surprised face and asked if she thought he might poison her. He then asked why they were getting married if Yu didn't even trust him. Yu reminded him that their relationship was purely business and that they didn't need to be subservient to one another. Dogok, undeterred, said she would have to marry him regardless. Confused, Yu asked what he meant by that. Dogok repeated that she didn't trust him enough to even eat his cooking. Thinking for a moment, Yu was pensive. Dogok told her not to worry. He would let her watch everything he did in the kitchen. Soon he was chopping vegetables and preparing the meal, while Yu observed, still trying to understand why he was doing all this. Suddenly, Dogok asked if she wanted to beat her sister, Ura. Yu tensed up at the mere mention of her name. Of course she wanted to defeat her. Dogok, while cooking, asked if she remembered what she had to do to accomplish that. Yu, confused, asked what he meant. Smiling, Dogok said that she had to love him. If she loved him, he would love her in return. Kira Tanghai was taken aback, sighing as she dismissed it as nonsense. Dogok laughed, telling her not to deny it, as it came from the heart. Oh, he found it amusing but still didn't see the point. Dogok continued cooking and then asked why she pretended otherwise. Turning to her, he asked who she was really fooling with her poor acting skills. Hira, Janghai, or even the financiers. They weren't so naive. The only way to deceive them credibly was for everything to be real. She had to be real. After hearing Dogok's words, Yu sighed heavily and said she understood. Summarizing, she told him to pretend to love her, but not to make it too fake. Dogok laughed and said she was confident. Too confident, perhaps. Yu, with a proud look, placed her hand on her heart and said that she was confident itself. Dogok smirked and said that in that case he looked forward to seeing her genuine self. By then, Dogok was almost done cooking. The second dish was nearly ready. Yu watched the process, but still couldn't figure out what he had been working so hard on. Finally, Dogok presented his dish, a radish dish with a creamy sauce. It looked truly appetizing. Yu stared at the work of art in bewilderment. Dogok handed her a silver spoon, and Yu looked at him questioningly, asking why she needed it. Dogok explained that if she had any suspicions, she could use the spoon to check the food. He reminded her that she had seen the entire cooking process and knew there was no poison involved. Dogok abruptly approached her, saying that this wasn't right. Yu looked at him in confusion as he scooped up a spoonful of food and ate it himself, to show her there was nothing wrong. Yu, even more puzzled, asked what he was doing. Dogok set the spoon down and, swallowing, told her he was just confirming the food was safe. Dogok smiled and told Yu to look at him, assuring her that as far as she could see, he was fine. Still in shock and confused, Yu continued to stare at him. Dogok held her gaze and told her that she could trust him now, though no, she should trust him. He asked why Oo was silent, but she simply told him to stop talking about it. Perplexed, Dogok asked again, just to be sure he hadn't misheard. Oo, frustrated, yelled at him, asking if he thought everything was forced. Dogok looked at her, guilty, and apologized. He hadn't meant to make it seem forced. He simply wanted to have dinner with her. He apologized again, not realizing how it had come across. Yu met his gaze and explained that it did seem forced to her. Then she told him she wasn't hungry, but her stomach betrayed her, rumbling loudly across the kitchen. Yu immediately blushed. Dogok, still understanding, said that if she didn't want to eat, she didn't have to. He took the plate away and apologized once more for making her feel pressured. Aya was taken aback by how much he had apologized. Dogok walked over to the trash can and began to dump the contents of the plate. Oo was stunned, her mouth hanging open. She rushed over to him, bewildered, and asked what he was doing. Dogok looked back at her, confused, explaining that since she didn't like it, he thought it would be best to throw it away. "You hate being forced to eat, don't you?" he said. Yu, now even more shocked, insisted that even if she didn't like it, he shouldn't have thrown it away. Dogok explained that he had been advised that sharing a meal together helps build bonds, but since things didn't go as planned, he sincerely apologized for the misunderstanding. He told her to go rest while he cleaned up the kitchen. Lu lowered her gaze, feeling a bit down. After all, Dogok had made the dinner because he wanted to get closer to her. But then Yu noticed again how Dogok was about to throw the plate away. She immediately ran to stop him. Dogok jumped in surprise, asking what was wrong. Dogok jumped in surprise, asking what was wrong. Earn realized that she had watched the whole cooking process, so there couldn't be any poison in it. But still, she realized it was only her own problem. She had been mentally consumed by her fears, but still, Yu decided everything depended on her determination. Gathering her strength, she asked Dogok to give her the plate. Dogok was taken aback, asking if he had heard her correctly. Yu, gritting her teeth, repeated her request. It wasn't a big deal that Dogok had prepared this food for her. Hesitant, Dogok held the plate and asked if she was sure, ensuring that she didn't feel forced. Yu assured him that she really wanted to eat it, so the plate of radish with balloon cream was placed back in front of her. Ben stared at it, feeling like it was her greatest fear. Holding the spoon in her hands, she tried to reassure herself. She had been reborn, and this time, things couldn't go wrong like they did in her past. With that thought, she decided not to lose control. Taking a spoonful of food, she frowned, her confidence shaken by fear. Dogok watched her closely, unwilling to leave her alone in case she needed help. When Yu swallowed the food, a wave of relief washed over her. Nothing had happened. She took another spoonful and began to describe the dish. It was soft, fluffy, and delicious. Just then, Dogok called out to her. It took 3 attempts before Yu turned her head. He asked if it was tasty, looking at her eagerly for feedback. Yu looked back at the plate, and then at him, and said that it was really delicious. Dogok sighed in relief, his expression softening. "Fortunately, it's fine," he muttered. Yu looked at him, puzzled, wondering why he had such a strange expression on his face. Dogok raised his head again and watched the girl with soft, kitten-like eyes. After a moment, he called out to her while she was eating. She yawned out of bed in confusion and asked what was wrong. With the same warmth, Dogok looked at her and then proposed that they live together. She immediately began to wonder what his true intentions were. She immediately began to wonder what his true intentions were. Do-gok explained that he wanted to experience married life with her. Watch movies together, maybe play games, and just spend time together doing various activities. He smiled and added that he wanted to try everything with her, starting today. Oo could hardly believe her ears. She asked him again, trying to see if he was joking. Do-gok reassured her, saying that no one else would come there, and his parents didn't even know about the place. Still, Yoo clarified that wasn't her concern. She looked at him and asked if he truly meant that they would live together now. Do-gok was momentarily surprised. He exhaled and told her that, while he didn't want to upset her, it was a bit of a stretch for now. He explained that he planned to live apart for a while to build up a better reputation in her eyes. Yoo seemed surprised but was secretly glad to hear that Do-gok would live separately for a while. Do-gok laughed and asked if Yoo was sorry about that. She quickly denied it. He then reminded her of something. The password that only Yoo and he knew. He assured her that no one would come there, so she could rest easy. Oo looked at him in bewilderment, feeling as though he was avoiding her. Just as Do-gok was about to leave, he suddenly remembered something else. He wanted Yoo to promise him one thing. The girl immediately asked what it was. He asked her not to enter the room at the end of the corridor under any circumstances. Surprised, Yoo asked, "The room at the end of the corridor?" Do-gok confirmed and repeated that she should never go in there. She promised not to, but she couldn't help wondering what was in that room. Do-gok also mentioned that he had prepared essentials and skincare products for her so she could take care of herself while he was away. Though Yoo wasn't thrilled about the cleaning, she agreed. Then Yoo remembered something and called out to Do-gok, who was about to leave. She asked if she could invite Soo-an over that day. She quickly added that she wouldn't do it if Do-gok didn't like it. Do-gok looked into her eyes and said that from now on, the house belonged to her too. That meant she didn't need to ask for his permission to invite anyone. Yoo's eyes widened in surprise at his kindness. Somewhat skeptically, she agreed. At that moment, Do-gok remembered something else. He pulled a key from his pocket and handed it to her. Yoo laughed and asked if it was the same key, now changed from a sweet key to a house key. Do-gok smirked and explained that it was the very same key she had used to enter the suite the day they met. Looking into her eyes, Do-gok said that he wanted to place his entire future in her hands. He asked if she had the same vision for the future. Yoo stared at him, mesmerized, then smiled and said that she had never imagined such a future before. Later, her friend Soo-jin came to visit. She was delighted, but puzzled, asking if this was really where Do-gok lived. Oo nodded, but mentioned that he wasn't home today. Falling onto the sofa, Soo-jin remarked with sarcasm that it was too bad, as she had wanted to talk to him. Soo-jin brought a tray of food to the table, but Soo-jin eyed it with suspicion and said she didn't like dry food. Yoo suggested ordering fried chicken, but Soo-jin pointed out that she didn't eat meat. Yoo sighed, then asked her friend if she was still the same. Soo-jin agreed, saying she really needed to change. Yoo thought for a moment and then recalled what had happened earlier with Do-gok's food. She smiled, feeling optimistic that things were improving. She then took a sip and said, "Maybe I can fix this," with rusty handles on the bedspread. Yoo smiled, saying she would gladly drink saju with Soo-jin at the diner. Soo-jin jumped up in horror and asked her not to scare her like that because it gave her goosebumps. The girl continued to joke around, and Soo-jin asked her to stop laughing. Yoo replied that she wouldn't do it anymore. Soo-jin raised his hand as she watched, her heart pounding for a second. Soo-jin decided it was time to get down to business. She opened her laptop and said they would now discuss everything about the Snogging Group Corporation. Sujan told her and said that the information would be high level, so she should listen carefully and memorize it. They would start with the most vulnerable point. Ko Yong, the chairman of the Sang Group Corporation. He was an easy target and a kind enough leader. His personal life was decent, and since he had failed in love through work, he was likely to settle for a love marriage. Therefore, he could be the easiest opponent to defeat. Yu diligently wrote down everything as Sujan continued. Next, Sujan moved on to Donggok's grandfather. He had retired from the chairman's chair and returned to his hometown to rest for a while. Sujan explained that although he had retired, he was still the most influential person in the Sang Corporation. In listened intently as her friend continued, talking about Inju, who had built and developed the company from scratch. He wasn't just Donggok's grandfather. He was someone they should pay more attention to. Sujan then talked about Donggok's half-brother, Jang Wakio, the CEO of the Sang Group and now the head of the corporation. He was known to be kind and honest, which made him good at his job. He also ran many charity projects. Sujan briefly mentioned that he once injured his leg, but it didn't make him feel uncomfortable. Wu asked if they would meet him anytime soon. Sujan replied that they probably wouldn't, so they could move on. Wu asked in bewilderment if that was it. Sujan clarified that she was talking about Janggok now. The girl sighed and said that based on her investigation, that was all she knew. She added that she had no further questions about him. However, she remembered Donggok's words about his brother. According to Donggok, Janggok wasn't sincere with anyone and was only real when alone with him. You realized that the person Sujan had described was completely different from what Donggok had said. She was eager to know what was wrong. Suddenly, Sujan added that there was one more important thing. Janggok didn't like Donggok. Wu was surprised. So, Janggok hated Donggok? Sujan quickly corrected her, saying that he didn't. Wu wanted to ask more questions, but Sujan reminded her that they still had a long way to go. She moved on to the next character. At that moment, a picture of an unfamiliar girl appeared on the TV. Sujan screamed in horror, not realizing she had clicked something on her laptop. She nervously scrambled to switch the picture, and on the screen was Donya, the youngest daughter of the corporation. Donya was Donggok's only sister and had the highest level of difficulty in this case. Though she didn't hold a high position, Donya had an eccentric personality. Sujan added that Donya had recently gotten married, and the one who smiled brightly and did almost nothing was Yoon, Donya and Donggok's personal secretary. He had a fairly low difficulty level and managed Donggok's schedule while also acting as an intermediary between him and his family. Yu thought for a moment, scratching her chin. Sujan asked if something was wrong. Yu replied that she was just surprised that Donya would cut her hair like that for him. How much did she love him? Sujan laughed and explained that Donya had done it because of her parents' objections. She had fallen in love with Yoon at first sight and was willing to do anything for him. Yu wasn't sure how to describe the bond between them, especially when their life together was at risk. He smiled and said it was the true love of their century. Sujan agreed, then said it was time to move on to the next one. Aunt Sujan, Madame Yuna. Wu said that this person had a 5-star difficulty rating, so she had to listen carefully. Madame Yuna was the owner of the Sion Group Corporation, 55 years old, and after her divorce, she had no interest in remarrying. However, her uncle had pursued her for 2 years, and they eventually married. Yu asked Sujan about her personality, and without hesitation, Sujan replied that Madame Yuna was fierce. The girl remembered how frightened she felt when she encountered her. She had never met anyone fiercer. When Dogok started his own company, Jang Makio had suddenly become the heir to the corporation, which didn't sit well with Madame Yuna. Yu thought about it, and asked if that meant she wanted Dogok to come back to the Sang group. Sujan thought for a moment, then said that it wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible either. Jan cheered Yu up, telling her that there was still a way to make it happen. Yu said that though her aunt seemed strict, she actually had a lot of feelings inside. Sujan was puzzled, as she had only ever mentioned Madame Yuna's fierceness. Yu confirmed that was correct. Sujan handed Yu an envelope and told her she could try to introduce Yona to her. At that moment, Yu opened the envelope and was very surprised to find a flyer for Jim's cooking class. Sujan explained that this cooking class was like a gathering of noble ladies. It was led by a woman named Jamie, and as far as Sujan knew, Jamie only accepted people into the class through personal connections. Sujan then looked into Yu's eyes and said that her own connections were extensive, and she had heard that Jamie could also provide high-level matchmaking and other useful information. After thinking for a moment, Yu remembered that her stepmother had also wanted to attend this class. As their conversation ended, Yu remarked that she hated fakes the most, her eyes becoming serious. While writing this down, she summarized that Dogok resembled her mother in many ways. Sujin then moved on to the last person they needed to discuss, the one with the highest level of difficulty. Yu looked at her in confusion and asked who she was referring to, as there was no one else. Just then, a picture of Dogok appeared on the TV screen, and Yu cried out in surprise. Sujin sighed and said that Dogok was the biggest problem in their marriage. She had heard that he had been a genius since childhood, always at the top of his class, highly intelligent and with superior looks because he had inherited the best genes. Now, he was the director of JC Sports. Sujin recalled his character and concluded that Dogok had the potential to cause trouble, though it was all an accident. Yu asked what kind of accident it had been. Sujin sighed deeply and said she didn't know much, except that Dogok had nearly died, and her aunt hadn't talked about it much. Before the accident, Dogok had been cheerful, hyperactive, and full of life. But after the incident, he became withdrawn, speaking very little. Yu asked what exactly had changed in him after the accident. With a hint of bitterness, Sujin explained that before the accident, he had been very happy. Even a little too hyperactive. Afterward, he became distant and quiet, his personality shifting entirely. Yu summarized that Dogok had changed after the near-fatal accident, and she wanted to know more about it. Sujan advised that Dogok directly, but added that she probably wouldn't get an answer. Oh was surprised and asked why Sujan thought that. Sujan replied that it was because U and Dogok were getting married, which was normal. Suddenly, Yu started to imagine walking and talking with Dogok, smiling at the thought of their future conversations. She decided that she should definitely try talking to him about it. As the evening began to fall, it was time for Sujan to leave. After she left, Yu decided she needed to take a bath. While showering, she took in her surroundings. The bathroom was decorated in pink. She thought about Dogok, who had told her why he had chosen to make everything pink. A smile appeared on her face as she looked at the rose petals. The colour pink, which she had once found strange, now seemed quite pleasant. Suddenly, Yu was jolted out of her thoughts and opened her eyes wide. She realised it was time to leave the bathroom and clear her mind. Looking at herself in the mirror, she reminded herself that this was just a marriage of convenience. Afterward, she stood in front of what she considered her favourite house, inspecting it. She realised that it no longer evoked any good memories. Finally, she opened the door and went inside. The house felt quiet and empty, though she had only been away for a few days. Yu had returned to collect her things. After a short while, she finished packing and closed the bags. She paused and silently looked around her room, as if for the last time. The room, which she had once loved, was now going to become a storage space. Standing with her suitcase, she wondered what would have happened if she had left much earlier. As she descended the stairs, she suddenly heard the door open sharply, followed by laughter. It was her parents. Her stepmother immediately asked if she was leaving so soon, smiling as she said they would definitely meet before the wedding. Her father only gave Yu a solemn look, his gaze filled with unspoken thoughts. The stepmother began to smile and told Yu that she wasn't sure about one thing, whether everything would go according to her plan. Yu smiled back at her and told them to stay home. Her father looked at her in confusion and asked what she meant. Yu, approaching them directly, stated that she was going back to the company. With a small smile, she asked them to treat her paintings with care and to also say hello to Yu, instead, of course, without waiting for any response. She bypassed them and headed for the door, asking them to guard her room carefully. Watching Yu leave, the stepmother decided to voice her thoughts. She asked Yu to stop, but the girl didn't listen. Turning around, Yu silently stared into her stepmother's eyes, then slammed the door, still not hearing the stepmother's screams. Recently, Yu had been stressing out her stepmother, and the woman couldn't find words to describe her anger. At that moment, Dogok was sitting in his office, reviewing another document. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted from a long day of work. Suddenly, someone knocked at the door, and reflexively, Dogok called for them to enter. Saya stood in the doorway, looking concerned. Dogok, surprised, asked what was wrong. Seo walked in, a little embarrassed, and handed him a folder. Dogok snatched it from his hands and began to read it carefully. After a moment, he set the folder on the table and looked up, asking if this would be successful, as it seemed trivial. Seo, still a little embarrassed, said that he thought it was possible. Dogok, not entirely convinced, replied that he didn't trust his own judgment. Seo asked what Dogok meant, and with a hint of sarcasm, Dogok smiled and said that Seo had low standards, especially when it came to women. Seo, grinning, said that if Dogok was giving him advice on women, he wanted to know if it was coming from experience. Dogok appreciated Seo's attitude and told him to show all of himself. Folding his hands behind his back, Dogok confidently looked Seo in the eye. Seo, a little hesitant, said that Yu didn't like him. Dogok smiled and asked if Seo really knew Yu that well. Seo looked away, replying that he knew her well enough. They had been together for 5 years. Looking back at Dogok, Seo added that she was only using him for her own benefit, nothing more. Dogok stood up from the table and muttered to himself. Apparently that's why they kicked Yu out in the winter, in the middle of the night. Seo didn't hear him and asked again, confused. Dogok shrugged, saying it didn't matter. He then added that Seo could use Yu however he wanted. Dogok explained that he was in love with her, and that it bothered him when other men spoke her name. He stepped closer to Seo and asked if it was possible for him to be in love with her. He couldn't understand how another man could just let her wander the streets barefoot in winter. Dogok's eyes filled with anger as he stared at Seos and told him to leave. Seos, bewildered, asked what Dogok meant, but Dogok didn't answer. Instead, he turned away and said if there was no more information, Seos should leave. Realizing he wouldn't get through to him, Seo nodded and left the room. Sitting back at his desk, Dogok realized there was still a lot of work to do. Sen asked why Dogok hated the department head so much, saying he had a good work ethic. Dogok sighed, saying that was the problem, he couldn't fire the man. While taking something from the refrigerator, Chen was surprised. Even though Seo is Yu's ex, are you really going to keep him working here? He asked. Dogok gave him an irritated look, wondering how Chen knew everything. As Sen went to grab a jar, Dogok immediately inhaled deeply, starting to fidget with his hands. Chen noticed and asked why Dogok was taking off his watch. Dogok began to remove it and, realizing what had happened, Chen quickly asked why. Dogok removed his drink and assured him he'd clean it up. Looking into his friend's eyes, Chen reminded him that he was the director now. He couldn't be so cruel. But at that moment, Dogok's hand shot out toward Ken. He closed his eyes, not wanting to witness Dogok's anger. But instead, Dogok merely extended his hand, pointing at his wrist, and asking if Sen could see anything. Completely puzzled, Sen said there was nothing there. Dogok withdrew his hand and asked if Sen couldn't see anything, then mentioned a memory from that day, when Yu had asked him if he had seen something on her wrist. Sen recalled that moment in a cafe, when Yu had shown him her wrist. Dogok was lost in thought until Sen interrupted, wanting to know what was happening. Dogok said everything was fine, then glanced down at his wrist. There, etched on his skin, was the same writing Yu had once had. The scene shifted to the darkest, most life-changing day of Yu's life, when she ran onto the road without noticing the speeding car. At that moment, Dogok was driving that car, his condition not good. He suddenly realized what had happened and, terrified, saw Yu unconscious in front of his car. Looking around, he saw Sesio holding Yu. The realization struck him. Their fates had intertwined at that very crossroads. Just then, another car slammed into Dogok's, and everything went black. Shifting back to Yu's apartment, it was already dark outside. Yu sat at her desk, writing carefully in her diary, noting important dates. She was left with only the people Shanghai had brought into the company. Closing the book, she reflected on the fact that to return to the company, she would need to form her own faction. Staring into space, Yu thought about whether such a faction had ever existed in her life. Gaze shifted to her watch, and she fell deep into her memories. It was the same house where she had grown up, and she was sitting on her bed, trembling with fear. The door to her room opened, and her stepmother entered, holding an hourglass. She turned it over and began reprimanding Yu, telling her that she had always been an unlucky child. Yu covered her ears, trying to block out the nightmare. But the woman kept talking, asking if Yu still considered herself happy, why she was constantly adopted only to be sent back. The woman told Yu that no one loved her, that she would never be happy, and that she shouldn't have been born. Tears streamed down Yu's face as she tried desperately to block out the words. Things would change from now on. Yu remembered her past when her stepmother used to say terrible things to her, that no one had wanted her since the day she was born, that no one in the world loved her, and that she was simply a dirty seed of misfortune. Her stepmother would ask who could ever want a child like her, and repeatedly told her she would never, ever be happy. What a horrible woman! This is why Yu needed someone on her side, and she thought of Jen, her grandfather's personal secretary. She already suspected that her grandfather had died in the future because someone had killed him, and she needed to stop it, no matter what. The next day, Yura was with Sevi, the sister of the cockroach, who was furious with Ihu for what she'd done to her and her mother. Sevi let it slip that she had seen Ihu getting too close to Huan, and even mentioned how suspicious it seemed that he took care of her so much. Yura then decided to use this information against Ihu. Meanwhile, Do-hook was deep in thought. He was jealous and felt so childish about it. He had never felt this way before, and it was all because of you. He remembered the first time he saw her, at the wedding of his employee, Seot. She had such a beautiful smile and looked so happy. The second time he saw her was at the company's year-end event, where he noticed Yu had distanced herself from everyone and was so deep in thought that she even cried. It hurt him to see her like that, and he didn't understand why. From that day on, he couldn't get her out of his mind. Now he had a dilemma. He didn't know how to tell her that he was responsible for her death. Later that day, Do-hook came home but was greeted at the entrance by his detestable stepbrother, a nasty guy who always wanted to hurt him. But Do-hook wasn't a child anymore, and he would never let his brother harm him again. In the following days, at Jaime's cooking class, a horrible old woman was bothering Do-hook's mother. She loved to pester her, and now she had even more reason to. Her precious son, Giona, was about to get married to an adopted woman. She had also heard rumors that Do-hook and the adopted woman's sister had a romantic encounter before. To her, this was terrible. But even worse was the beating that Do-hook's mother gave the old woman. However, they didn't expect that today, the adopted woman, Yu, would arrive for her final cooking test. For everyone there, Yu was shameless. But Jaime welcomed her warmly. Today was her test, and everyone would decide if she was fit to stay and receive lessons. She had to prepare a dish in 40 minutes. A few days earlier, Yu had arranged an interview with Jaime, simply wanting to explain why she wanted to take the classes. Yu's answer was sincere. She wanted to please someone, and it was obvious who that was, John, her future mother-in-law. She explained about the test she had to take, and today was the day. The 40 minutes passed, and her dish was ready. It looked delicious, but upon tasting it, well, it wasn't. It even seemed like she had tried to poison them. Clearly she needed to take cooking lessons. Everyone there had gone through this same test before, and their first dishes were just as awful, if not worse, so she was welcomed. At that moment, Yonghwa stormed out angrily, and Yu ran after her. Given the situation, Yonghwa asked her to accompany her as she was going to have tea with her. However, the meeting was terrible. Her future mother-in-law had invited someone else as well, and this made things very uncomfortable for Yu. Yonghwa knew this and did it on purpose. Yu didn't hesitate to show her true self with her sister. She went to the bathroom, but the annoying Chura followed her, wanting to confront her. Like Bu, she had the support of Do-hook's mother and supposedly wouldn't let Ihu take anything from her. But Ihu thought the same. She wouldn't let Yura take anything that belonged to her. Back at the table, Cheong explained that she never intended to use her son to improve the family situation. That's why she allowed her son to meet Yura. However, she hated the rumors, like the idea of two sisters fighting over one man. She directed this at Ihu, telling her that everything would be solved if she stepped aside, as she knew that the first date was with Yura. Clearly, Yura was thrilled by this, but I would not tolerate further humiliation. She told them that the only one who had the final say was Do-hook, and he should decide. Her future mother-in-law was furious, but before she could insult her, Do-hook arrived and asked his mother to stop being rude. He apologized to Yu, admitting that he hadn't called her earlier and was sorry for it. But Do-hook wanted to take Yu away from that horrible place as quickly as possible, leaving Yura and her mother stunned. Do-hook had come because he knew something like this would happen. His mother didn't want to accept his marriage, but he knew that soon things would change. As he was taking Yu home, she asked him to stay and have tea with her. Yu seemed to be overcoming her food trauma when she was with Do-hook, which was a very positive sign. There's no doubt that he was helping her a lot. But all good things must come to an end, and he had to leave soon. When he got home, his mother was waiting for him, worried and angry at the same time. Do-hook wanted his mother to understand that even if she opposed it, he would marry Ihu no matter what. He also mentioned that now that she had met her, she would understand why he had fallen in love with her. He informed her that he was even thinking of returning to his father's company, not just for Ihu, but for something else he needed to finish within a year. Afterward, he went to his room, clearly remembering Ihu. From the moment he saw her, he knew he could do anything for her. The following days, Do-hook visited his friend Seonli, a psychiatrist and close friend who was in love with Do-hook's best friend, though he only existed in video games. With Seonli, Do-hook discussed his childhood traumas. He still feared and had nightmares when he slept, but being in a relationship helped him a lot. However, living under his parents' roof made things worse, and Seonli told him the solution was simple. He should live with his girlfriend. Being in love would help him even more. Of course, love could cure everything. After the session, Do-hook understood it was possible, but living with Ihu was something his heart might not be able to handle. Still, he considered it. Later, Do-hook visited Ihu at her house. She opened the door but suddenly ran off. He went inside, not knowing what was happening, and asked her if she was looking for the trash. But no, she was holding a work of art, or rather, a burnt brownie. But it was a brownie, something edible. Ihu was about to throw it away when Do-hook offered to try it, something he quickly regretted. He didn't want to be rude, so he said, "It's good, not bad for a first try." But in reality, this was her 5th attempt. When she tasted it, she knew he was lying about it being good. Do-hook then admitted the truth. Cooking wasn't her strong suit, though for him, cooking came easily, as he was good at everything. Mr. Humility. On the other hand, Ihu was also good at something, drawing. But she had given it up a long time ago, although lately she had been feeling different. Do-hook wasn't the only one. He confessed that the reason he came to see her today was simply that he missed her. Meanwhile, Yura came home late, and her mother was waiting, curious about her blind date. The truth was, Yura wasn't interested in anyone except Do-hook. She wouldn't let that possibility slip away, especially since she had the support of Do-hook's mother, Giona. If Giona liked her, it was possible she could turn people against Ihu and finally win Do-hook. She also mentioned to her mother that she suspected something strange between Yu and Huan. According to Sevi, they were close, and this news was perfect for Hong. It would give her daughter a huge advantage. Back with Do-hook and Ihu, after his confession of missing her, Do-hook mentioned that he wanted to live with her in that house. He made the excuse that they should practice being a married couple, since they would often attend family gatherings and needed to act naturally. His excuse was really more for her, as she wasn't good at pretending. Also, they needed to get to know each other better. For Yu, though, this excuse felt very real. so she agreed. She told him she would send him a portfolio of everything she liked and asked for his email. Do-hook couldn't be more surprised. He was always so unpredictable. She then explained that she meant they needed contact, to look into each other's eyes, hold hands, live together, and act like a couple in front of everyone. She asked him to start getting to know her right away, bringing out a bottle of wine. Since Ihu could only drink if she opened the bottle herself, that's what she did. Soon, the questions. The old lady from the cooking classes, Mrs. Bonga, started bothering Jonna again, always trying to annoy her. She constantly tried to upset her, especially because Jonna was going to have a daughter-in-law, despite her engagement being called off weeks before dating her son. For Jonna, this was trivial, as Sue must have had her reasons. Since Bolga couldn't upset her with this, she claimed to have heard that the reason Hyohook had a leg problem was because of Do-hook, who, out of envy, broke her leg. This infuriated Hyohook. How can she talk about things she knows nothing about? Gionna thought, and they started arguing again. But this time, Bonga grabbed Jonga by the hair. It didn't last long, though, as EU intervened, snapping a photo of Mrs. Bonga and warning her that if she didn't leave her future mother-in-law alone, she would file an assault complaint or send the video to her future father-in-law, who surely wouldn't appreciate having such a troublesome mother-in-law. EU also mentioned that her grandfather was good friends with Judge Min. At that moment, the old woman started shouting at Yu, calling her an adopted, ill-mannered girl, and even managed to give Yu a good slap. Jun, unable to tolerate anyone harming her future daughter-in-law, intervened. The argument escalated, with Bonga accusing Ihu of recording without consent, to which Yu conceded was illegal, but Yu pointed out that the security cameras had enough evidence to file an assault report. Then Ihu asked Jaime for help, and Jaime agreed, saying Bonga's damage was already done. Jaime decided to remove her from the group, considering refunding her money, but ensuring she would never return. Jaime had overlooked her behavior for too long, but could no longer do so. Before Bonga left, Yuju demanded that she apologize to her future mother-in-law. Later, after leaving class, Youngwei was waiting outside. Despite the earlier defense, she told Yu not to think it meant they were now on good terms. Eju understood more than anyone how difficult it was to win someone over, having tried for 20 years with no success. This moved Yuju. What kind of life must Eju have had to think that way? Eju asked if there was any possibility this time could be different, as they might soon be family. Days later, Sue received a message from Do-hook informing her that they would soon have a family meeting. For Uhu, it was too soon, so she distracted herself by drawing, which brought back memories of that day on the beach when he found her. She ended up drawing him, which was strange since she barely knew him. Did she feel something for him? Did she feel something for him? The next day, Yi-Hu visited her grandfather, who was recovering in the hospital. Yi wanted to ask him how long he had known she was his biological granddaughter. He replied that he had known for some time, but hadn't yet told his son. On the other hand, Yi also wanted to know about her biological mother, but according to his investigations, her mother had passed away. This didn't affect Yi-Hu much, as she had no interest in knowing her. Although Yu still held some anger toward her grandfather, seeing how much he cared for her made it hard for her to hate him. She told him that if he wanted to see her married, he'd better not die. Afterward, she had a conversation with Hyun, asking him to take her side. He wanted to know how desperate she was for his help. Knowing him well, she offered him Rawon's art gallery, which held the painting he'd been seeking for so long. They made a pact, with Chen giving her 1 month to deliver the painting. Do-hook, growing impatient, gave her 1 week to decide about living together. Yu, having made up her mind, accepted. After all, when they got married, they would have to live together. To start this, they needed to build a strong bond, trust each other, and get to know each other deeply, inside and out. He went first, asking her to enter a room he had kept secret, his greatest treasure. A place of games. He wanted to play with Ihu, who had never played these kinds of games before. She kept losing, but he found it fun playing with her. He confessed that he had always been alone there, as it was the only place he could hide from his brother, who hated him. Since she was the first person to enter this place, Yu wanted to be honest with him. She revealed that she couldn't eat food cooked by others because someone had poisoned her food when she was little, nearly killing her. She even developed eating disorders, but she didn't know who had done it. This was the first time she had shared this, except with Sujin. This confession was a significant step for both of them, as they began to truly get to know each other. Later that day, Do-hook returned home and once again encountered his awful stepbrother. His brother made a comment about meeting his fiancée, saying she would be even prettier when she cried. Do-hook was reminded of the past, how he had rescued a small kitten, cared for it in secret, only for his brother Hook to find out and attempt to kill it simply because Do-hook loved it. That day, Do-hook ran away with the kitten to protect what he loved. This time, he was prepared to do the same. He didn't hesitate to warn his stepbrother, saying, "If you go near Ihu, I'll break your other leg." The next day, Do-hook returned home, and he and Ihu began living together. Since they now lived together, they needed to practice things like looking into each other's eyes, holding hands and hugging. After all, they would have to kiss at the wedding. Do-hook insisted it was necessary because she wasn't a good actress, and Ihu, swallowing the story, agreed. If it helped with her revenge, it was worth it. Out of nowhere, she hugged Do-hook, albeit awkwardly, but a hug nonetheless. Do-hook showed her how to do it gently and without pressure. Her heart felt like it was about to burst, though she didn't understand why. Was she starting to like Do-hook? Jo-hook held her hand, telling her that whenever he held her like that, it meant he would protect her, that she was safe, and no one would harm her. In the days that followed, Jonna visited Do-hook's grandfather. He knew very well why she had come. He understood that she liked her son's fiancée, but was looking for a way to oppose the marriage. His grandfather knew that Do-hook was destined for greatness, even to one day lead Sogang, he told her. "It's Shiwan, isn't it?" Jonna was surprised. How did he know? The truth was that Do-hook's father, Jeon-jun, had arrived half an hour earlier and told him everything. Now, the grandfather realized that they could use Ihu for their own gain. The weekend finally arrived, and the big family meeting took place with Do-hook's family. Everyone was serious, but Do-hook's father was the first to be polite, something Yoonga didn't like, as she still refused to accept the marriage. Then, out of nowhere, Donna shouted that if anyone had questions, they should ask them now because she didn't want to waste time. Juk chimed in, saying he knew things about his future sister-in-law, that she was adopted, had recently broken off her engagement, and that Retail had financial difficulties. Do-hook was furious. But Yu held his hand, reminding him of the protection signal, which calmed him. Do-hook no longer cared what they said about her. He knew her well now and loved her deeply. Ihu added, "Yes, what Do-hook says is true. She has many flaws, but her feelings for Do-hook are real." Do-hook, just as ugly as Yura, was left speechless. This pleased Do-hook's father, though they soon moved on to dinner. Yu went to the bathroom where Do-hook followed her, bluntly telling her that she didn't like her because she was Yura's sister, whom she hated. But Yu responded that she too hated her sister, so they were on the same side. Donya was left speechless, and Yu added, "But I do like you." After dinner they headed home, but Yoong, Do-hook's mother, wanted to talk with Yu privately. She knew they seemed determined, but asked Yu for a favor. She wanted Do-hook to take over the family business and gave her 6 months to make it happen. Of course, they would be married before then, but if Ihu couldn't do it within that time, she would have to leave Do-hook. Since Ihu had already discussed it with Do-hook, she gladly accepted the challenge. Later, when they returned home, Ihu asked Do-hook if their marriage was solely to secure his grandfather's investment. He admitted it was partly true, but also that he wanted a real marriage. He told her that if she wasn't ready for that, she should escape while she still could. But for Ihu, there was no need to run. Her plan was clear: no escape, no real marriage. "I don't have much time," she told him. When Do-hook asked how much time, Ihu remained silent, as both were certain that the mark on her wrist signified her life's limit. When she didn't respond, Do-hook offered to buy whatever time she had left, meaning that whatever she was trying to do, he would do it for her. But she didn't understand why. In response, he said it was because he wanted something real. So if she wished, she could use it, but in exchange, he wanted her to stay by his side for the rest of his days as his true wife. In the following days, Sae visited her father's house, particularly his room. As she entered, she took a hair from her father's pillow because she wanted to uncover the truth at all costs. However, just as she was about to leave, Yura found her. Yura wanted to know what she was doing there, and Yura explained that she had come to see her because there would soon be a meeting to introduce her family. She informed her that the date was set for September 20th at 6 p.m. With this news, Yura exploded with rage. Why? Why did she have to be so infatuated with Do-hook? The truth was, Yura was the one obsessed with Do-hook. After just one date with him, she already believed herself to be his. However, she had to calm down, because Do-hook would make the final decision. All she had to do was share the date they had to meet. In the days leading up, Do-hook and Donya accompanied Ihu to try on her wedding dress. After their conversation, Donya ended up supporting Ihu because she knew Do-hook could be quite cold in such matters, but it felt like déjà vu. And of course, Do-hook knew why. After the accident in which he died, he had returned to life a year earlier. When he woke up, he thought it had just been a crazy dream, nothing more. But Do-hook reminded him that today he had to accompany her to the bridal shop, the same place where Ihu would try on her wedding dress. As they arrived, Do-hook saw Yehu in a torn wedding dress and remembered Ju's wedding with the cockroach. If it ended with him, it meant she had also gone back in time. Since then, 2 months had passed, and now Yehu was trying on a wedding dress to marry him. The usually expressionless Do-hook was stunned by her beauty, and even Donya was happy with how she looked, taking advantage of the moment to snap a picture of her brother's amazed face. Ihu looked perfect in the dress. Although she felt butterflies in her stomach, she reminded herself that this was all just an act. She didn't realize, however, that she was starting to have real feelings for Do-hook. Later, when they returned home, hunger set in, and Ihu wanted to prepare a meal. Even though it wasn't a great idea, the mini-arguments between her and Do-hook started again. To resolve it, Do-hook proposed a game. Whoever lost would cook. Guess who lost? Do-hook, of course, and even though he had tried hard, he didn't use tricks and intentionally lost. Later that night, as Do-hook was getting ready for bed, he received a message from Do-hook. She sent him the picture she had taken of Ihu in the dress. Using this as an excuse, Do-hook went to see Ihu. He asked her if she wanted the picture Do-hook taken, though logically he could have sent it without asking. He just wanted to spend more time with her and didn't want to leave. He asked what she was doing, and she told him she was drawing, even offering to show him. Do-hook entered Ihu's room and admired her drawings. But when he saw the next one, he was shocked. It was a portrait of him. Ihu tried to explain, saying she was simply drawing what came to mind, but it was clear that she had been thinking about him. As Do-hook looked at her other drawings, he noticed one of the accident. It made him feel guilty, so he asked Ihu why she had drawn it. She repeated that she was just drawing what came to mind. Do-hook asked to keep the drawing, and Ihu finally agreed. Despite how strange it all seemed, Do-hook returned to his room, promising himself that this time he would protect Ihu and wouldn't let her die. Meanwhile, Yura, frustrated by her failures, turned to drinking. She called Seok, the cockroach, and, as always, he came running when she called. Yura was thrilled to see him and told him that Yu had arranged the meeting between the two families. She began to cry, blaming Seok for allowing her engagement to be broken. To calm her down, Seok revealed that he had heard Do-hook's grandfather would only invest in his company if Do-hook got married. Yura now had an advantage, knowing that Ihu and Do-hook's marriage was likely only contractual. Finally, the day of the family dinner arrived. Do-huk's father, as always, was very kind, and his stepmother pretended to be as well, even saying they were happy that their daughter, raised like a princess, was marrying Do-huk. Do-huk, who was sitting with Iyu, held her hand to calm her, which made Yura furious. Suddenly, Iyu brought everything into the open, asking what the family would receive in return for their investment in the company. Do-huk's mother quickly asked, "And what do we get in return?" She added that favor repays favor. The stepmother calmed down, and they began discussing the grand wedding they wanted to plan. Do-huk's father said that for today everything was fine, and they would discuss the wedding plans soon. After the dinner, Yura approached her stepmother, sensing that she wanted to ruin the wedding at any cost. When the older woman called her imprudent, Yura retorted that she had been this way since she arrived at their home, no longer just a servant. Onja jeered, saying, "What can you expect from someone with trash DNA?" Onja laughed and asked if she was talking about Yura. Pulling out the paternity test results, it was clear now. Yura was not her father's biological daughter. Yura wasn't her father's biological child. It was terrible luck for Yura, because now Ihu knew the truth. He immediately tried to dismiss it as a lie, but Ihu, seeing the fear on her face, knew it was real. "Are you trembling then?" Ihu asked. Even so, she made a proposal. "I'm willing to keep this a secret for now, on one condition." She had to give her the posthumous painting by the artist Gion. It was that, or she would expose the truth. All she needed to do was plant the seed of doubt, and soon enough the truth would come to light. If she accepted, she was to call her as soon as possible. A few days later, Yur finally held in her hands the painting that Juren had been searching for. Along with it, she included an invitation to her wedding. Soon after, she revealed the truth about Yura not being her father's biological daughter. To Yur's surprise, Huron already knew, having investigated it at the president's request. He knew even more than she did, including that Yur was the president's biological granddaughter. That was why Yu asked him to keep her grandfather safe, as she feared that He Yonye would soon try to harm him. On top of that, she also wanted his help to investigate Yura's biological father. Weeks passed, and finally the big day arrived. Today was the wedding between Hyun and the handsome Do-huk. Despite the excitement, Reo had to endure the presence of her annoying stepmother, who came to inform her that her father had fallen ill and wouldn't make it to the wedding. She added coldly, "Not that it matters, he's not really your father after all." A comment that only amused Reo. Seeing that Reu already knew the truth, Hye grabbed her tightly, vowing that she would never let Reu win. But just in time, Yonghwa arrived to rescue her. Her mother-in-law defended her and quickly sent the stepmother away. With her help, Reu realized that her mother-in-law had now repaid the favor she owed. Even so, Reo was left deep in thought, wondering what had really happened to her father. Just then, her grandfather arrived, looking much better, and reassured her that her father was fine. He had been poisoned but was now recovering in the hospital. What bad timing. It was her wedding day. It was clear who was behind the poisoning, but despite it all, her grandfather asked for the honor of walking her down the aisle. The ceremony began, and her grandfather proudly escorted her, hoping she would find happiness with Do-huk. After the vows were exchanged, all that remained was the kiss to seal their union. By then it was clear to everyone that their feelings for each other had grown, making the kiss even more special. It was a public display of their love, and they ended the ceremony with an "I love you." Thankfully, the wedding had gone well, and Iyu had already gained the favor of Do-huk's family. However, her own family hated her even more now. The only dark cloud was the nagging thought that their marriage had started as a contract and might never be truly real. The next morning, Do-huk woke up to find that the bride had left for a trip alone. He called Ihu, only to learn that she had gone on her honeymoon by herself to Jeju Island, supposedly to clear her head, particularly to forget about their kiss. Her feelings for Do-huk had deepened, and she was frustrated because she didn't want to think about him. But out of nowhere, Do-huk also showed up on Jeju Island. He hadn't taken long to find her. The only problem was that Yu had chosen the seaside as her escape, and Do-hook had a deep trauma related to the sea. Ihu couldn't understand why Do-hook, who hated the sea so much, had come all the way there to see her. Why hadn't he stayed home? Do-hook responded, "Do you really not know why, or for whom, I came all this way?" Ihu felt nervous, but before she could say anything, Do-hook confessed, "I've never liked crossing boundaries, but today I want to. You can stop me if you don't want this." He moved closer to her, and Ihu didn't know what to do. She wanted to kiss him, and for once she didn't want to think about the time they had left. She didn't want to leave with regrets. She let herself go, momentarily forgetting her desire for revenge. With her unspoken permission, Do-hook embraced her tightly and whispered, "I came all this way because I wanted to see you." Then he kissed her. Later, they went together to the room Ihu had rented. Since Do-hook hadn't brought his wallet, he cleverly stayed with her. Ihu decided to cook for him. But while chopping vegetables, she accidentally cut herself. She felt ready to give up. She wasn't good in the kitchen. Do-hook teased her, saying it was probably Jae's fault for not teaching her properly. When Ihu asked if he knew Jae, Do-hook replied, "Of course, she was like a teacher to me." He then shared a bit of his past. A long time ago, he found a small kitten trying to escape the rain. He took it home and cared for it, but one day while Do-hook was out, his brother tried to kill the cat, leaving it badly injured. That was just how his brother was, always destroying the things that mattered most to him. Fortunately, Do-hook arrived just in time and tried to expose his brother, but no one believed him. So Do-hook ran away from home to protect his cat, not knowing where to go or what to do. That's when Jae, who happened to be passing by, helped him. Luckily, Jae loved cats, so she took care of him and his little kitten. His kitten passed away last year, but Jae was now raising the kitten's daughter and granddaughter, and Do-hook hoped to take Ihu to see them someday. Night came, and seeing that there was only one bed, Do-hook prepared it and placed a pillow between them. He warned Ihu, "If you cross the line, that means you're mine." They both lay down to sleep, but it was uncomfortable. At some point, Ihu unintentionally moved her hand across the pillow. As Do-hook had warned, this meant she was his. Eventually, they decided it would be fine if they just held hands while they slept. During the night, Do-hook asked Ihu about her life, and she shared a bit. When she was little, she was a normal child, always getting into mischief and being scolded. Do-hook, on the other hand, had always been obedient and got along well with his friends. In the middle of their conversation, Ihu drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Do-hook suggested they go for a walk. Ihu was concerned for him, knowing how difficult it would be because of his trauma, but Do-hook reassured her, saying that as long as she held his hand while they walked, everything would be fine. After all, it was their honeymoon. Reluctantly, Ihu agreed, and they set out for a walk, though Do-hook found it hard to face his fear of the sea. The forceful sound of the water was overwhelming, and Ihu reached out to offer her hand. However, Do-hook suddenly remembered he wasn't wearing his watch. He quickly covered the date tattooed on his wrist and then took Ihu's hand. They went on to have a wonderful day together. Meanwhile, Hyun had finally collected all of his father's paintings, thanks to Ihu. He had met her when she was just a little girl, and she had given him a drawing she made herself because they were friends. Since that day, Hyun had always been on her side. But as he was reflecting on this, he noticed the mark on his wrist. He, too, had travelled back in time by 1 year. Strangely, he had died on the same day as Ihu. The days passed, and the honeymoon came to an end. After returning home, Do-hook started acting distant. Ihu noticed that he hadn't done well on the flight, so she decided to make him some tea and bring it to his room. However, when she arrived, he was asleep. She considered leaving the tea and going, but then Do-hook started talking in his sleep. "Please, don't kill me. Don't kill me," he murmured, leaving Ihu shocked. She tried to wake him up, and when he did, he woke in a panic, begging Ihu to call Sion. Before long, Sion arrived. He asked Ihu how long she had noticed Do-hook acting strangely. She explained what had happened on their trip, something that surprised Sion, as he never thought Do-hook would dare visit Jeju Island, especially going to the beach. He asked Ihu to avoid such places in the future, but Ihu wanted to know why. Before Seon could answer, Do-hook woke up and asked to speak with him alone. So Ihu stepped out. After a while, Seon emerged from the room and informed Ihu that Do-hook had fallen asleep again. He left, and Ihu thought about how strange it was for Do-hook to be so afraid of the sea, but she didn't want to dwell on it too much. Instead, she decided to head to the kitchen and cook something for him. Later, after preparing some oatmeal, Do-hook woke up. Hungry, he eagerly began eating and was thrilled by how delicious it was. But then Iuk gently asked how he was feeling. Do-hook apologized for worrying her. He had thought he was better, but clearly he wasn't. Today, he wanted to finally tell her what was really going on. Do-hook confessed that he was terrified of the sea. Several years ago, he had gone on a cruise with his family, and that's when the accident happened. His brother Juk had pushed him overboard. Do-hook instinctively grabbed onto Juk's leg out of fear, desperate not to fall into the water. He started screaming, "Please don't kill me, don't kill me!" But Juk kept trying to shake him off, and in the struggle, both of them fell into the sea. Do-hook thought he was going to die in the ocean. Weeks later, he woke up from a coma, only to hear people talking about how it had all been his fault, that he was the reason his brother had broken his leg, that he was envious of Juk. Everyone thought he was the villain, even though that wasn't true. Not even his parents believed him. From that day on, every time he saw the sea, it felt like he couldn't breathe. The medication had helped, but he still hadn't fully recovered from the trauma. He explained to Ihu how difficult it was for him to be at the beach with her and how much it affected him. Do-hook was simply trying to endure something that was incredibly hard for him. He, too, had suffered as a child, and in that way, he and Ihu were alike. But now, Ihu felt guilty. Do-hook had forced himself to go to the beach, knowing how difficult it was for him, all because she wanted to be there. He faced the sea, because he truly cared about her. Meanwhile, Yura and Sei, the sister of the cockroach, as they called him, were having a meal together. Sei had already learned that Ihu had ended up marrying Do-hook, and it made her furious. She wanted revenge on Ihu for Yura's sake, and had already devised a plan that she thought would be perfect. Sei, an influencer with 800,000 followers, was determined to expose Ihu on her social media. She was confident that this would ruin Ihu's life. She was just waiting for the right moment. On the other side, Do-hook was chatting with his best friend, Seon. Seon was curious about how the honeymoon went, though the conversation didn't last long. Seon was excited because he had finally gotten in touch with the conceptual artist they had been trying to reach for days. The artist had agreed to work with them, and it turned out to be Yu Han, the wife of the CEO. She was exactly the artist they needed. As soon as Do-hook heard the news, he rushed home to talk to Ihu. He told her about Seon's call, and although he didn't want to pressure her, she agreed to consider working on the project, saying that they did need her. In return, Ihu asked if Do-hook was sleeping any better or still struggling with insomnia. Knowing that he was still having trouble, she offered to help him sleep that night, as he had gone to the beach for her, so the least she could do was be there for him. Later that night, Ihu fulfilled her promise. She came over to keep him company and brought a storybook she had illustrated herself, hoping it would help him relax. The truth was, just having her by his side helped Do-hook immensely. Out of nowhere, he kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love you." Ihu, after watching him fall asleep, thought to herself, "I love you too." Feeling closer than ever, she decided to work alongside Do-hook. The next day, Do-hook was talking to his mother. She had found out from Ihu that he had been sick, and while Do-hook was concerned that she had spoken to Ihu, knowing that his mother didn't like her, things had changed. The day before, Yu had visited his mother and told her about their honeymoon, a gesture his mother appreciated, especially since her son hadn't called her. She wanted Do-hook to visit her with Ihu. Later, during a meal, Do-hook's mother noticed that Ihu hadn't eaten much and asked if something was wrong. Do-hook was surprised, but his mother was intuitive and began to suspect something. She wondered if someone had tampered with Ihu's food in the past. Although Do said nothing, his mother sensed there was more to the story. He eventually confessed that when Ihu was a child, she had fallen ill from something she ate. Now Do-hook's mother understood more about the difficult life Ihu had endured and suspected that Ihu's stepmother was to blame. Do-hook reassured his mother not to worry, promising that he would make sure Ihu got better. Meanwhile, Ihu arrived at the company and noticed that everyone was dressed quite casually. Soon, she was called to a meeting. Se-won, after a brief interview with Ihu, hoped she would stay on as an illustrator for the next game they planned to launch. The job would be in person for the duration of the game's development, which meant she would have colleagues, including Chok Rock, who was part of the design team and its leader. Se-won was aware of their past but didn't seem to find it strange. Later that evening, Do-hook had prepared dinner for Ihu, and as they were about to eat, Ihu casually mentioned that starting Monday she would be working at the office. This didn't sit well with Do-hook, knowing that the cockroach was there too, but he had no choice but to accept it. Meanwhile, Honjae, Yura's stepmother, went to visit her husband, Yura's father. She wanted to know what he had planned for Yura, as she was currently just a simple office worker in the company. Honjae hoped that he would promote Yura to a managerial position, but her husband insisted that Yura didn't have the experience for such a role. Honjae tried to persuade him, saying that Yura was still young and could learn quickly, but it seemed Yura's father wasn't as easily swayed as she thought, which left her frustrated. On top of that, Yura's grandfather had disappeared, and Honjae was convinced that he was being hidden somewhere, needing to find him soon. The next day, Ihu visited Haimi and they chatted about Ihu's wedding, which Haimi found lovely. However, Ihu noticed burn scars on Haimi and grew curious. Haimi explained that a long time ago there had been a terrible fire at her house, and for a moment she thought she was going to die, but she managed to escape. She left out the detail that she had fled with her daughter. After the fire, Haimi had a hard time dealing with the trauma, becoming so afraid of fire that she couldn't even go near the kitchen. But over time she overcame it, even taking a cooking course. What helped her through it was the hope that one day she could find someone she had lost in the fire. And yes, she eventually did find that person, though it took many years, and that person had never been far from her. That night, Ihu came home excited, knowing that in just a few days she would start her new job. But she still offered to help Do-hook sleep well that evening. Since he didn't want her to read him any more stories, Ihu offered to let him use her arm as a pillow. Out of nowhere, Do-hook asked, "By the way, when will you confess your feelings?" He knew she had feelings for him, but Ihu didn't respond. The next day, Do-hook confronted his best friend, Seon, asking how he could have set up his wife to work in person, especially alongside her ex, Juk. It wasn't even possible to fire the cockroach since he was good at his job, and that was what frustrated Do-hook the most. Despite Seon trying to explain that Ihu could work from home if she wanted, Ihu insisted on working in the office. She was excited to share experiences with her colleagues and be part of the team. Sensing Do-hook's discomfort, she asked him directly, "Do you not want me to work?" It wasn't what Ihu thought, so Do-hook confessed that he was simply feeling jealous. Ihu reassured him that he had no reason to be jealous. She didn't have any feelings for S. In fact, her eyes were only for one person now, and it couldn't be more obvious. Realizing the truth, Do-hook let go of his worries. Ihu was eager to run off to work, but this time Do-hook stopped her. Today, he would be the one to take her to the office. After several minutes, they arrived at the office, and Ihu was shown her desk. Of course, it was right next to the cockroach, Jok. However, she quickly met Sumi, a friendly designer on the team, who even recognized her from the wedding. Just as they were getting acquainted, Jok walked in. Sumi had an incredible opinion of him. Rich, handsome, tall, and perfect in every way. However, Ihu realized she had a potential rival. The leader of the other team was interested in Do-hook and had even cried when she received the wedding invitation. This person was none other than Do's acquaintance, Si-akim. Later, during a break, Si-akim confronted Ihu, reminding her of the bitter days from high school, where Ihu had been bullied by this very same venomous woman. Sia Kim hadn't changed at all. Aihu, on the other hand, had grown stronger. A little while later, Aihu met with Ju-on, who had uncovered some information about Honje but hadn't yet discovered the identity of Yura's biological father. Still, Aihu was grateful for his help and thanked him for attending her wedding, especially for ensuring that her grandfather could be there too. As she went through the information Ju-on had given her, she came across a file on a woman who looked familiar. Hu Jin-song. She had once worked as a curator at the Rowan Art Gallery, but had mysteriously disappeared years ago without a trace. Coincidentally, her disappearance happened around the same time rumors about money laundering through art began circulating. Aihu decided to ask Ju-on to dig deeper into this matter. Meanwhile, Honje, having lost a battle, plotted to put Ihu in her place. She suggested to Yura that she should marry Do-hook. After all, he was the current successor of Seong-gang. She filled Yura's mind with ideas, asking, "Wouldn't you like to see those two fools brought down with nothing left?" Even though Do-hook was now married, Honje believed they could still ruin him. The only way to destroy him completely was to become part of his family and tear his life apart from the inside. In the following days, Do-hook's mother and sister Donya met up. His mother wanted to buy a gift for Aihu, and Donya was aware of this since she also liked Aihu a lot. Together they picked out a present, but as they didn't know where Do-hook and Aihu lived, his mother, Yonghwa, called Aihu. After a few minutes, Yonghwa finally arrived at Aihu's home, but upon seeing her, she realized Aihu wasn't well. She was sick. Yonghwa helped Ihu to her room, tucked her in, and even offered to cook for her, despite not being great in the kitchen. She tried her best, nonetheless. Later, Yonghwa checked on Ihu again, and she was still unwell with a fever. Concerned, Yonghwa was about to call Do-hook when Ihu grabbed her hand tightly and murmured, "Mum, don't leave, Mum." Yonghwa knew she wasn't her mother, but it didn't matter. She stayed by Ihu's side, determined to care for her until she felt better. A little while later, Yonghwa finally informed Do-hook about Ihu's condition. Even though he was in an important meeting, his wife's health was his top priority. He immediately left the meeting, putting his trusted friend in charge, and rushed home. When he arrived, his mother left, and Ihu was feeling better, though she was disappointed she hadn't been able to properly thank her mother-in-law for taking care of her. Do-hook reassured her, saying the most important thing was for her to rest. After checking that she was all right, Do-hook stepped out, and Ihu reflected on what had happened. She thought about what she had said to her mother-in-law and how Yonghwa had stayed to take care of her. It brought back memories of her childhood with her adoptive mother, who had always been so sweet and loving. As Ihu drifted off to sleep, she began to dream. In her dream, Ihu saw her mother walking away, and suddenly her mother's photo began to burn. She woke up startled, confused as to why she had dreamed all of this. Then she noticed someone beside her. Do-hook had returned and spent the entire night by her side. After checking on her, he saw that Ihu was feeling better, and this brought him relief. However, Ihu felt uneasy, seeing how much people worried about her. She wasn't used to this kind of care and didn't want others to suffer because of her. She felt sad and alone, but Do-hook reminded her that he was there for her. He promised that he would always protect her and never leave her for any reason. Meanwhile, in the following days, Yura was having lunch with the cockroach, Juk. With her twisted mind, she suggested to him that there was a possibility Ihu still had feelings for him, encouraging him to take advantage of the fact that they were now co-workers. However, Juk knew this wasn't true. Yura didn't understand why he kept talking about how happy Do-hook and Ihu seemed together. It made her angry and upset. But Yura was waiting for him to say something about how happy, but she continued manipulating Juk, reminding him that she had pressured him into committing to Ihu even though he still loved Yura. Regardless, she didn't hesitate to reveal that she liked another man. Furious, Juk retorted that if she had really cared for him, she would have tried to meet him at his level, despite his poverty. But Yura coldly told him that his background was precisely why he didn't deserve her. She then mentioned that she had a date with Do-hook's brother and that her father approved of it. Juk was outraged, but Yura calmly stated that her only priority was to marry and ruin Ihu's life. She even asked Chuk to provide proof that Ihu and Do-hook's relationship was purely contractual. This woman was clearly out of her mind. On the other hand, since Do-hook's emotional confession, Ihu had been avoiding him, feeling embarrassed. However, it didn't last long. Do-hook decided to follow the advice given by his brother-in-law. Step 1. Give Ihu a compliment, but that didn't work. Step 2. Make her feel special with a gift. He gave her a rose and made a heart shape with his fingers which, while not melting her heart, at least made her laugh. There was still one step left. Look her in the eyes and offer a sincere apology. He told her he didn't want to make her uncomfortable, hugged her, and promised to give her space, waiting until she was ready. However, he asked if they could start over, as they had skipped all the typical stages of a relationship. He suggested they begin as a normal couple, dating, getting to know each other. Though it sounded strange, Eve agreed to think about it. The next day, Ihu was chatting with Sumi when she received a call from her father-in-law, inviting her to his house. As soon as she entered, streamers flew and everyone clapped, welcoming her. Ihu was even wearing the gift her mother-in-law had given her, which made her feel excited. They handed her a gift basket of flowers as a symbol of how they wanted to officially welcome her into the family. Seeing how well her in-laws got along and feeling their warmth made Ihu incredibly happy to be part of this family. The next moment they all sat at the table. Do-hook's father had prepared a meal, but unfortunately, since Yonghwa already knew about Ihu's situation, she told her husband that she had prepared something special for Ihu. They brought triangular jinban, Ihu's favorite, wrapped neatly. Ihu was so surprised and excited, feeling incredibly happy that her in-laws had put so much effort into making her feel welcome. They also thanked her for being so kind to their son, as they believed she had helped him change for the better. Later, Do-hook arrived home, saw the basket of flowers, and was glad to know that Ihu was happy with the gift. However, Ihu wanted to ask him if he had told his mother about his problem. Do-hook, clearly nervous, apologized, but Ihu reassured him that there was no need to apologize because his mother had been very kind to her, which made her feel so grateful and happy. Despite that, she was still unsure if she was doing the right thing. As the night went on, it was time for bed. Just as Huhu had helped him fall asleep before, Do-hook wanted to return the favor and help her sleep. They were in bed, and since Huhu still hadn't given him an answer about being his girlfriend, he didn't want to do anything that might make her uncomfortable. He just wished her good night with a gentle kiss on her forehead. The next morning, Ihu received a call from her brother-in-law, Donya, who invited her to a concert. She was so excited, screaming and singing along to the songs of her favorite artist. However, Ihu didn't feel particularly moved by it. Donya kept insisting that she should meet Byun. Initially, Ihu had refused, not wanting to meet him, but after letting her feelings lead her, she had become such a fan of his. This made Ihu wonder if she was also denying her own feelings for Do-hook. Donna then made her promise not to repress her emotions any longer and to always be honest from now on. Ihu agreed to the promise. That night, after seeing Do-hook, she couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. She crossed the line and kissed his hand, giving him a shy yes. From that moment on, they were officially a couple, and all boundaries were gone. It marked the beginning of something real. However, the good times ended abruptly when a post by Seiwi, the sister of the cockroach, went viral. While working as usual, Sumi soon became worried and received a link to the post from Jin. The post was meant to tarnish Ihu's reputation, claiming that she was only with Do-hook for his money, calling her a fortune hunter and accusing her of being adopted. It even mentioned that she had always been this way, even back in high school. Amidst all of this, Ihu went to the bathroom, still trying to understand what was happening and who had written such things. Just then, Sumi entered the bathroom and, as usual, started speaking badly about Ihu, digging into her past. She told everyone that it was true. Ihu had always been a fortune hunter. Ihu was furious, knowing that despite the time that had passed, Sumi was still the same venomous person. But this time, Ihu walked out of the bathroom as if nothing had happened. She went to see Do-hook, and when she entered, all the people who cared about her were there, ready to support her. At that moment, Do-hook's brother-in-law, Donya's husband, informed her that the post had already stopped spreading. Now, the only thing left to do was find out who wrote it, as they weren't going to let it slide. With everything in place, everyone was prepared to ensure Aihu's safety. After everyone left, Do-hook rushed to hug Aihu, assuring her that everything would be resolved soon. She went to the cafe, and once again Seo was fueling the fire in the office, something Aihu couldn't tolerate anymore. She approached Sia and, in a strong voice, corrected her rumors. First of all, she hadn't broken her engagement with Suk for Do-hook. It was because Suk had fallen in love with someone else. Furthermore, Sia had no right to talk about her just because they went to school together. Had she forgotten that she spread false rumors and even slept with their classmates? Hearing this, her friends realized she was just a bully. Sia demanded proof, but just then Sujin arrived. She was the proof. Sia had humiliated her for a long time, accusing her of dating the guy Sia liked. If Sia still thought of herself as innocent, Sujin could call all those who had suffered because of her. She then spoke to the two co-workers of Aihu, telling them that just as Sia spoke ill of others, she would speak ill of them too when they weren't around. That's how people like her are. Later, they gathered at Do-hook's house to talk about the awful Sia, and Donya wanted her to be fired. Meanwhile, Donya was about to feed Uhu, but Do-hook ate it for her. Uhu understood that Donya's lack of awareness of her condition wasn't good, so, seeing how much support she had, she decided to confess her trauma. She shared her story about being poisoned when she was a child, and how, to this day, she still couldn't eat anything prepared by others. But, little by little, she was healing. Donna hugged her, understanding the pain she must have endured, and assured her that she wasn't alone. After the visitors left, Aihu, a little drunk, felt happier and more excited than usual due to all the support she had received. She was also grateful to Do-hook. Suddenly, she threw him onto the couch and kissed him, a kiss that led to who knows what. The next day, the police finally found the person behind the false post. It was Sei. Immediately, the cockroach arrived to defend his sister. A few nights earlier, Sei hadn't known what else to say about Aihu. She felt bad because she had broken her engagement with her brother, leaving them without money, and felt envious that Aihu had married a better match. She had felt satisfied with what she had written, but that satisfaction quickly vanished when the police called her. She immediately called Yura for help, but Yura, being the cold woman she was, told her that just as she got herself into this mess, she should get herself out of it. And so it ended. The cockroach then knelt before Ihu, apologizing on behalf of his sister. He admitted she was still immature and he apologized for deceiving her just to please Yura. Although the apology came too late, Ihu saw it as an opportunity. She decided to forgive him, but only if he agreed to a condition. A few days ago, Jamie had told Ihu that Honji, her stepmother, wanted her to help arrange a date for her daughter Yura with Hu. Now that Ihu knew this, she asked the cockroach that from now on he should share everything he knew with her. With Yura, Do-hook must inform her immediately. He must uncover his sister's true intentions and tell Ihu everything. That evening, Do-hook had prepared a delicious dinner, and they talked about their relationship. Ihu, lost in the conversation, ate by herself, without needing Do-hook to say or do anything. It seemed like she was finally healing, and that made them both. On the other hand, the cockroach was talking to his sister. He told her that she couldn't keep doing this. She was very upset because due to the recent events, she had to publish that everything she said about Aihu was a lie. Now, everyone was against her. Her brother just wanted her to grow up and stop doing senseless things, but Soi was furious. She wanted revenge. And not on Aihu. She was talking about Yura. Yura had incited her to do this and then washed her hands of the situation. Her brother asked her to wake up and live her life well because he wouldn't always be there to help her. But Sevi didn't listen. It went in one ear and out the other. In the following days, Donya visited Do-hook's company to deliver some documents. She took the opportunity to ask him if he planned to return to his father's company, since his grandfather wanted him to take over the leadership. She explained that it seemed like Yuk was trying to turn people in his favor. Donya told him that if he decided to take on the leadership, she would support him, but he needed to act fast before Jae-hook ruined the company. Do-hook then saw that his father was calling him, and that night he visited him. His father was worried because photos of Lee-hoo with Ji-won had arrived at his office. Do-hook clarified that Lee-hoo was not cheating on him and his father believed him, but it seemed someone was following her and they had to be careful. The next day, as planned, Yura and Do-hook went on a date. It seemed like Yura didn't think much of Do-hook, but that was part of her plan. She told him that her sister and Do-hook were supposedly marrying for a contractual obligation, since her grandfather would only invest in Do-hook's company if he married. She also revealed that her sister had a trauma. When she was young, she ate something poisonous and almost died, so she couldn't eat anything that others offered her. This made Jeo-hyuk begin his plan. That night, Yu returned home. Do-hook was excited and he had cooked and cleaned the house. As he wanted, he was congratulated by her, but everything he did was because he was worried about Lee-hoo and didn't want anything bad to happen to her. Later that night, as Yu was about to sleep, she noticed the lights in the living room were on. She went to check and saw Do-hook asleep. She approached him and noticed he had photos of her with her grandfather's secretary, Yu, but that wasn't all. She also noticed the mark on Do-hook's wrist was exactly the same as hers, and it was the same date. Lee-hoo began to remember that bitter moment. How could it be that he died the same day she did? The next morning, Lee-hoo and Do-hook were having breakfast, but she was very angry. Do-hook asked her what was wrong, and she showed him the photos he had been looking at the night before. She wanted to know if he had ordered the investigation on her, but he hadn't. Do-hook explained that those photos had reached his father and even to his own phone. But he shouldn't worry. His father knew who the man was, and he had known for a long time that Lee-hoo was with him. He hadn't told her because they were airing their dirty laundry that day. Lee-hoo couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't trust him anymore because he had been hiding so many things. She took Do-hook's hand and removed his watch, wanting to know why, even after seeing the mark, he didn't tell her anything. She asked him why he had the same date on his wrist as hers. Do-hook had no choice but to tell her the truth. That date was the day he had the accident. He couldn't avoid the crash and ended up killing someone who appeared out of nowhere. That person was Lee-hoo. Lee-hoo discovered that he had killed her, but Do-hook continued to explain that after that, someone hit him, and that's how he died as well. She wanted to know when he found out about the mark, and he was honest with her. He had seen it the first day they were together, but he didn't tell her the truth because he thought it would ruin everything. Even before all of this started, he explained how confused he had been when he opened his eyes and remembered that bad dream. But it wasn't until he saw her leave that dress shop that he realized he had gone back in time. Since that day, he had wanted to meet her. Then Soo-jin informed him that Lee-hoo wanted to meet him, so he agreed. He wanted to see with his own eyes that Lee-hoo was okay. But that wasn't the first time he saw her. He met her on the day of his marriage to Seob, and the second time was at the company's New Year event. From that moment on, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He didn't know why, but after seeing her again, he understood. That was when he saw the mark on her wrist and he realized she, too, had traveled back in time like him. Lee-hoo, enraged, finally understood that it was his guilt that made him help her from the beginning. Part of it was true, but then she apologized for her rashness, leaving him with a bad memory. Do-hook explained that he now understood why he had never stopped thinking about her. It was because he had unknowingly fallen in love with her. He wanted her to understand his feelings, but Lee-hoo was hurt, living among lies. It was only natural for her to think everything was a lie. All this time he had only been trying to comfort her because he felt bad for her. So none of it had been real. After everything that happened, Lee-hoo left the house and visited Soo-jin. She asked if she could stay at her place, and of course Soo-jin agreed. They ate together, and this time Lee-hoo ate without worrying about anything. Her broken heart made her suffer, but she knew that being able to eat was thanks to Do-hook. She understood that none of it had been real. But she had to know that everything changed after meeting Do-hook. Before, she had been cold and distant, like a hedgehog with sharp quills. But after meeting his cousin, she felt so comfortable and, for the first time, truly happy. For Yu, it felt like everything had been a lie. She couldn't understand what was real. She was torn, feeling resentment toward him, but beyond that, she loved him with all her heart. From that moment, she didn't know what to do. She had no one to tell about her return to the past, so she kept it to herself. When she went to work, she focused solely on that and tried to avoid Do-hook. She wasn't ready to face him. Soon, Do-hook left on a business trip, which made things easier for her. But one night at a company dinner, Do-hook showed up, as expected, and sat next to his wife. But next to Yu was also the annoying Dea, who, using the excuse that she was drunk, splashed water on Yu. Do-hook quickly tried to help her, but the foolish Dea grabbed his hand, which infuriated Yu. A little later, Dea was gossiping with her co-workers, mocking Yu, the supposed CEO's wife. They knew the two didn't care for each other based on how they acted. Yu overheard everything and decided to defend herself, saying, "I only came because I'm also an employee of this company. But now I understand why you're uncomfortable. Could it be because Miss Dea is interested in my husband?" Yu didn't hesitate to point out that she had seen Dea holding her husband's hand and had been harassing him for some time. Dea asked if Yu had any proof, and just then Do-hook came to defend his wife. Yu warned Dea to be more careful with her words from now on. With that, Dea and her little friends ran off. Following this, Yu wanted to talk with Do-hook. They went to a park and Yu told him that she had been reflecting on everything. She knew that he had known the truth from the beginning, and yet he had deceived her. She had tried to focus on the good, but to her not everything felt real, and it hurt. But what hurt her the most was that despite everything, she still loved him. At that moment, Do-hook embraced her and apologized. Yu could no longer silence her heart. She loved him. She had fallen for him and clung to the hope that he felt the same. After talking, they kissed, and Do-hook confessed his love for her as well. Moments later, Yu mentioned that if the dates on their bracelets marked the end of their lives, she didn't want to waste a single minute. Do-hook wanted the same, although he knew this time they wouldn't die. He would make sure of it. And from that day, the two lovebirds reconciled. The next day, Sumi mentioned to Yu that it seemed like the cockroach was going to resign from his job. Soon after, Yu's phone rang. It was Zin, wanting to share something urgent. Meanwhile, Do-hook was in a meeting. It seemed they had captured the person who delivered those photos, but the person had no idea what they were handing over, so they still didn't know who was truly behind it. For H, the most likely suspects were Yu's family. To his father, it was strange. Why would they do this to someone who, even though they aren't related by blood, had lived with them for so many years? But based on past events, they knew Yu's family wasn't loving. Just then, Yuk entered the room. He had overheard the entire conversation and showed them what had been sent to his phone today. He had investigated and discovered it was from someone Yu had been close to since the orphanage. Do-hook mentioned that the person was the secretary of Yu's grandfather. However, Duke added that he had heard Yu's sister-in-law had germophobia and couldn't eat anything other people gave her. He blamed Do-hook for marrying someone so problematic, but his father quickly put him in his place. Even if it hurt, Yu was now part of their family, and they had to protect her. Meanwhile, Yu was waiting for Sujin. As she spoke with Juon, she mentioned the recent photos of the two of them that had been delivered, which meant they wouldn't be able to see each other for a while. However, she asked him to keep an eye on her grandfather and, once and for all, get information about Yura's biological father. At that moment, Sujin arrived, happy to hear that Yu and her cousin had reconciled. Yu then asked Sujin for a favor, to investigate more about Hyunjeli, an employee of her family's gallery who had disappeared years ago. Zin agreed, but she had actually come to share information about Jin. She revealed that Jin had gotten married 15 years ago in the United States, was widowed, and inherited a large fortune. Jin had returned to Korea and used that money to start her cooking classes, but there was no further information about her. Meanwhile, Do-hook visited Jermai's cats, the ones descended from the cat Do-hook had rescued in the past. Thanks to Jermai, the cats were now well cared for, and Do-hook felt at ease. He told Jermai that he wanted to ask a favor. He wanted to learn more about Jeongjeli, the director of the Raon Art Gallery. He knew she was the one with the most power. Do-hook also mentioned that Yu wanted the company, and he planned to make her the owner. He hoped Jaime would help, and Jaime knew there would be no problem. To gain full control, the major shareholder, Yu's grandfather, had to return, and she knew he would support Yu without hesitation. The next day, the cockroach met with Yura. He showed her the photos he had obtained through an agency and told her that he had sent them to President Sei, Gyo-hook, and Do-hook. Sek then asked if Yura had sent Sei to post lies on his profile. Of course, Yura denied any involvement. The cockroach became furious, asking why Yura was so obsessed with the situation. Do-hook knew that doing this would hurt her even more, but Yura was showing just how crazy she was. She told him that all she wanted was to see Do-hook and Yu miserable because it wasn't fair. She had planned to marry Do-hook, but Yu had taken him as revenge. Yura claimed she had never hurt Yu, but Seok knew better. He knew that Yu had spent her entire life enduring abuse and discrimination. Yura then asked Seok that if they found her, he should turn himself in on her behalf. But when Seok refused, Yura added that if he helped her, she would hire a lawyer for his sister. For this one time, she needed his help. In the days that followed, Do-hook went to find his wife at work because they had to go out together. They had a family dinner. When they arrived, everyone was happy to see Yu, especially since the rumors about her had calmed down. However, Do-hook was furious because she knew who had caused this scandal, Yura, a horrible person. But thanks to everyone's support, things were fine. Yu's father mentioned that he had prepared food for her and asked if she could eat it. Now that Yu was recovering, she could, and she happily showed everyone, which made them all excited. But before anything else, Yu had something to share. Just then, Gyo-hook arrived, and he wasn't alone. He had brought Yura with him. Clearly, no one liked this woman, especially Donya, but they couldn't just kick her out, so they quickly sat down at the table. Gyo and Yura weren't asking for permission for a wedding just yet. They were just getting to know the family. Moreover, since Yu was adopted, there was nothing wrong with dating her sister-in-law, Gyo insinuated. This infuriated everyone, but Yu didn't care. She knew the truth, and when everyone found out, Yura would suffer. As Yu was about to eat, Yura expected her to embarrass herself. However, Juk asked about her condition, and Yu took the opportunity to tell everyone that when she was young, she fainted after eating food laced with arsenic. She had nearly died and from that day couldn't eat anything given to her by others. This was a surprise to many, and Yura quickly said, "It wasn't my mother," but Yu added, "Now I'm fine. I've overcome it, thanks to Do-hook." Everyone was thrilled, happy that Yu was now doing better. Seeing how much the family treasured Yu enraged Yura, as she had won the love of the entire family. Later, Yura met with the cockroach and was furious to see that Yu had been accepted by Korea's most prominent family. She blamed Sok, thinking that if he had married her, none of this would have happened. In her frustration, Yura mentioned that the suspicions about a contractual marriage might be true, as Gur believed it too. This angered the cockroach. He told her that she would never be able to destroy Yu and was only hurting herself by trusting the wrong people, but Yura didn't want to give up and asked Sok to bring her proof.